Hello everyone, I am the Crime Teller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. In the autumn of 2013, deep within the industrial heart of Essex, a quiet but cunning man named Daniel Whitmore orchestrated one of the largest human smuggling operations in UK history. Unlike the brutish and reckless traffickers that often made headlines, Whitmore was meticulous. A former maritime logistics expert with a history in international shipping, he had spent years refining his methods, ensuring that no trace of his activities could be easily uncovered. His network was vast, stretching across continents, from Southeast Asia to Eastern Europe. He worked with corrupt officials in port cities, leveraging his knowledge of customs loopholes and shipping routes. What made his operation especially insidious was the fact that his clients, the desperate souls seeking a better life, rarely ever saw him. He was a ghost, operating through intermediaries, ensuring that even if a single part of his chain was exposed, he remained untouchable. By 2013, Whitmore had established himself as a near-mythical figure among human traffickers. He used legitimate shipping businesses as fronts, carefully mixing contraband cargo with legal shipments. His containers carried textiles, machinery, and sometimes perishable goods, just enough to mask what was hidden within. He had developed a particular preference for refrigerated shipping containers, knowing that they would avoid routine inspections due to their delicate nature. These containers were often loaded in remote warehouses, away from prying eyes, and shipped via ports in Belgium and the Netherlands before arriving in the UK. For years, his smuggling ring had gone unnoticed. He had smuggled hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people into the country. Some arrived safely, slipping into the underground labor market. Others were less fortunate. Many suffocated during transit, their bodies quietly disposed of in abandoned docks or deep forests before authorities could ever link them to a crime. By early October of that year, Whitmore had set his sights on his biggest operation yet, a shipment of 50 individuals from Vietnam, all seeking passage to the UK. The demand was high, and the profits even higher. He arranged for them to be transported through a labyrinthine route, beginning in Hanoi and passing through China, then into Eastern Europe, where they were loaded onto trucks bound for Belgium. The final leg of their journey would be aboard a refrigerated lorry, scheduled to arrive in Essex. But this time, something went wrong. The night was cold, the damp air clinging to the concrete walls of an old warehouse on the outskirts of Zeebrugge, Belgium. The facility had been abandoned for years, its rusted shipping containers stacked high, remnants of a once bustling trade hub. It was here that Daniel Whitmore's operation was about to reach its most dangerous phase. 50 people, their faces drawn with exhaustion, stood huddled together under the dim glow of a single overhead light. They had been traveling for weeks, some for months, moving through jungles, deserts, and hidden border crossings under the cover of darkness. They had endured hunger, thirst, and the constant fear of betrayal. Each had paid a fortune, some as much as £30,000, to secure their place in this final shipment. For many, it was everything they had, borrowed from entire villages that placed their hopes on their success. The group was mostly young men, with a few women and even 2 teenagers, barely 16. They had heard stories of those who had gone before them, some who had made it, sending money back home, others who had vanished without a trace. But fear was a luxury they could not afford now. They were here, at the precipice of their new lives, and there was no turning back. The truck itself was an ordinary white Scania refrigerated lorry, indistinguishable from thousands of others on the road. Its exterior was spotless, its paperwork flawless. It belonged to a logistics company registered under a shell corporation, which itself was owned by another holding company, buried deep in layers of legal obfuscation. Whitmore had learned long ago that in the world of smuggling, visibility was death. His name was never attached to anything, no documents, no accounts, no records. He was a whisper in the shadows, moving people like pieces on a chessboard. The driver was a man named Mark Davies, a British national with a record of minor offenses: petty theft, smuggling small goods, tax evasion. He was a perfect candidate for the job, desperate for money, skilled behind the wheel, and most importantly, completely unaware of the full extent of what he was transporting. Whitmore never trusted his drivers with too much information. The less they knew, the less they could betray. As the group prepared to board the lorry, a man stepped forward, his face tense with worry. His name was Min, a former schoolteacher from a rural town in Vietnam. He had left behind a wife and a newborn son, promising to return with enough money to build a new life. Now, as he looked at the airtight, metal box that would be his home for the next 12 hours, panic gripped him. He had heard rumors, stories of others who had died in transit, locked in these cold, airless spaces. He hesitated, looking around at the others, but the smugglers were already moving. There was no time to second-guess. One by one, they were ushered inside, their bags tossed in after them. The doors slammed shut, sealing them in darkness. The air inside was thick, filled with the scent of sweat and desperation. Someone whispered a prayer. Another muttered words of encouragement, promising that by sunrise, they would be in England, free to start again. Outside, Whitmore watched as the lorry's refrigeration system was adjusted. Not too cold, just enough to fool thermal scanners at checkpoints. It was a delicate balance, too warm, and the bodies would give off heat, too cold, and they would freeze before they even reached their destination. He had done this before. It had always worked. Mark climbed into the driver's seat, adjusting his cap as he started the engine. The truck rumbled to life, its headlights cutting through the night as it pulled out of the warehouse and onto the open road. The journey had begun. Whitmore didn't stay to watch. He never did. He had other business to attend to, another shipment, another deal, another pile of cash waiting to be laundered through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts. He had built an empire out of human desperation, and as long as there were people willing to pay, he would continue. But this time, something was different. A small miscalculation, a shift in the routine. Something was about to go terribly wrong. The truck rumbled down the empty highway, its tires humming against the wet asphalt. Inside the sealed container, 50 souls sat in silence, their breathing shallow, their bodies packed together like cargo. The walls of the lorry were slick with condensation, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of fabric as someone shifted in the darkness. For the first few hours, the journey seemed tolerable. The air was thick but breathable, and though the space was cramped, it was still manageable. Min sat pressed against the cold metal wall, his arms wrapped around his knees. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He thought of his wife, of his son, of the future he had been promised. Just a little longer, he told himself. Just a few more hours, and this nightmare would be over. Mark Davies, the driver, lit a cigarette as he sped through the French countryside. He had done jobs like this before, transporting goods across borders, no questions asked. But something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the extra security, the nervous energy of the men loading the cargo, or the way Whitmore had avoided giving him direct eye contact when handing over the envelope full of cash. At the Channel Tunnel checkpoint, Mark kept his composure. He had done this before, smile at the officers, present the forged paperwork, answer any questions with short, confident replies. He rolled down his window, flashing his transport license at the customs officer. Carrying frozen meat, he said, just like the paperwork stated. Delivery to a warehouse in Essex. The officer barely glanced at the documents before waving him through. It was routine. Thousands of trucks passed through the tunnel every day. There was no reason to suspect this one was any different. Mark exhaled as he drove onto the train that would carry the truck beneath the English Channel. He felt the familiar lurch as the train began its slow journey through the tunnel, carrying him and his hidden passengers toward the United Kingdom. Inside the sealed container, the air was growing heavier. What had started as a tolerable discomfort was now turning into something far worse. The temperature had dropped, but the oxygen levels were also decreasing. Min could feel it in his chest, the tightness, the struggle to take in a full breath. Someone knocked against the metal walls. 3 sharp bangs. A signal. Nothing. No response from the outside. Someone else tried, this time pounding harder. A woman near the front of the group began to cry softly. The realization settled over them like a thick fog. Something was wrong. Min clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. Panic would only make things worse. He thought of his wife, of his son, of the promise he had made to return. He could not die here. Not like this. Hours passed. The air inside the container turned stale, the oxygen thinning with each breath they took. The first to pass out was a young boy, barely 16. His older brother shook him, whispering his name, but the boy didn't respond. Then another, and another. Their bodies slumped against one another, their shallow breaths barely audible in the suffocating darkness. Outside, Mark pulled the truck off the highway, following the GPS coordinates to an industrial estate in Essex. He parked in a secluded lot behind a warehouse, stepping out to stretch his legs. He checked his phone. No messages. He was ahead of schedule. He leaned against the truck, taking another drag of his cigarette. He could hear nothing from inside the container. The refrigeration unit hummed softly, the steady whir of machinery drowning out any sound from within. After a few minutes, a black SUV pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The vehicle came to a stop a few feet away, and two men stepped out. One of them was Liam Carter, Whitmore's right-hand man. The other was a man Mark didn't recognize, tall, with sharp features and a permanent scowl. "You're early," Liam said, checking his watch. "Traffic was light," Mark replied, tossing his cigarette to the ground. "You got my money?" Liam nodded, handing him a thick envelope. "Count it later. We need to unload first." Mark glanced at the truck. "Should I open it?" Liam waved a hand dismissively. "We'll handle it." Mark didn't argue. He had been paid to drive, nothing more. He stepped back as Liam and the other man unlocked the container doors, pulling them open with a metallic groan. The stench hit them first, a thick, suffocating wave of sweat, urine, and something else. Something worse. Then they saw the bodies. 50 people, crumpled against one another, their faces frozen in expressions of agony and desperation. Some had clawed at the walls, leaving deep scratches in the metal. Others were still clutching onto loved ones, their fingers intertwined even in death. Liam swore under his breath, stepping back. The other man remained silent, his face unreadable. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Liam muttered. Mark felt his stomach turn. He had smuggled goods before, drugs, weapons, stolen electronics, but this was something else. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Liam didn't answer. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number with shaking hands. Whitmore's voice came through the speaker. "Is it done?" "We have a problem," Liam said. "They're all dead." There was silence on the other end. Then a slow, deliberate exhale. "Get rid of them," Whitmore said, "and clean up the mess." The line went dead. Liam lowered the phone, glancing at the bodies. His expression was unreadable, but his next words were clear. "Burn the truck." The wind howled through the abandoned industrial estate, carrying the faint scent of burning rubber from a distant warehouse. Mark stood frozen beside the truck, his stomach churning as Liam Carter issued the order. "Burn the truck." The words settled in Mark's gut like lead. This wasn't just a job gone wrong, it was a massacre. He had spent years running shipments across borders, smuggling contraband under the noses of Border Patrol and Customs officers, but never had he dealt with something like this. The other man, tall, silent, and efficient, moved without hesitation. He disappeared behind the truck, returning a moment later with a jerry can. The sharp scent of gasoline filled the air as he unscrewed the cap and began dousing the inside of the container, the liquid sloshing over the bodies piled within. Mark swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe through his nose. He could still see their faces, their frozen expressions of horror, their fingers curled as if still clawing for air. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked, his voice lower than before. Liam shot him a look. "You want to be the one explaining this to Whitmore?" Mark didn't answer. He knew better than to argue. The silent man finished emptying the jerry can and stepped back. Liam pulled a lighter from his pocket, flicking it open with a casual ease that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. With a single motion, Liam tossed the lighter into the truck. The fire caught instantly. The gasoline-soaked bodies ignited with a sickening whoosh, flames licking up the metal walls. The heat was immediate, pushing them back as black smoke billowed into the cold night air. Mark turned away, his heart pounding. This wasn't what he had signed up for. This wasn't a simple delivery gone wrong. This was something much darker. He had to get out, but getting out of a business like this wasn't as easy as walking away. Liam's voice cut through the roaring flames. "Get rid of your phone. Now." Mark hesitated. "You made calls on it, right?" Liam pressed. "Sent texts? You want to leave a trail?" Mark clenched his jaw. His fingers tightened around the device in his pocket. Then, with a deep breath, he pulled it out and tossed it into the fire. The plastic casing melted instantly, the screen cracking before disappearing into the inferno. Liam nodded, satisfied. "Now get lost." Mark didn't need to be told twice. He turned on his heel and walked away, forcing himself not to look back. His heart pounded as he climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He needed to disappear. The fire burned for hours. By the time authorities were alerted, the truck was nothing more than a twisted, blackened husk. The metal walls had warped in the heat, buckling inward as if the vehicle itself had suffered alongside its doomed passengers. Local firefighters worked to control the blaze, their faces grim as they uncovered what remained inside. What had once been 50 people was now a charred mass of unrecognizable bodies, melted together in a grotesque display of human suffering. By morning, the scene was swarming with law enforcement. The smell of burnt flesh still lingered in the air as forensic teams combed through the wreckage, cataloging what little evidence remained. Detective Eleanor Walsh arrived just after sunrise, her breath visible in the crisp autumn air. She had seen plenty of gruesome crime scenes in her career, but nothing had prepared her for this. She adjusted her coat and stepped closer to the wreckage. "What do we know?" A forensic officer shook his head. "Not much. No plates, no identifying marks on the truck." The fire wiped out most of the evidence. Walsh exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. "Victims? Too many to count. We're estimating around 50. Likely human trafficking." Her stomach turned. She had been chasing these kinds of cases for years, smuggling rings operating in the shadows, ferrying desperate souls across borders in the back of trucks like livestock. But this was beyond cruelty. Someone had killed them all to cover their tracks. She turned to the officer. "Survivors?" He hesitated. "None that we know of. But we did find something." He handed her a small, charred object wrapped in plastic. It was a mobile phone, melted, barely recognizable, but still somewhat intact. Walsh took it carefully. If the data could be recovered, they might have a lead. She looked back at the wreckage, the blackened skeleton of the truck still smoldering in the morning light. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase their crime. But she wasn't going to let them get away with it. Mark Davies sat in a dingy motel room on the outskirts of town, staring at the flickering television screen. His hands were shaking as he poured himself another drink, the whiskey burning his throat as he swallowed. He had seen the news. They had found the truck. They were looking for answers. His mind raced. He needed a plan. Disappearing wasn't going to be easy, not with Whitmore and his men watching. They didn't take kindly to loose ends. He rubbed his face, exhaling shakily. There was only one way out of this. He needed to run. But no matter how far he went, he knew one thing for sure. The dead would always follow. Mark Davies hadn't slept. The motel's flickering neon sign cast a sickly red glow through the thin curtains, making the room feel smaller, suffocating. He sat on the edge of the bed, his fingers twitching as he gripped the cheap glass of whiskey. His reflection in the cracked mirror across from him was gaunt, hollow-eyed. The news reports had been relentless. Every channel played the same gruesome footage: charred remains, the twisted metal skeleton of the truck, crime scene investigators in hazmat suits sifting through the ashes. The words human trafficking, mass murder, and organized crime filled the screen. And then, the real nightmare began. Authorities had managed to pull data from the burned phone recovered at the scene. Mark knew what that meant. Somewhere in that wreckage, there were traces of him. His calls, his messages, his presence. And if the police had them, so did Whitmore. A knock at the door sent a jolt through his spine. It was too soon for the police. They'd never knock first. Whitmore's men, however. Heart pounding, Mark grabbed the small pistol he had tucked beneath the motel pillow. His fingers were slick with sweat as he cocked the hammer back, forcing himself to take steady breaths. Another knock. 3 short raps, then silence. Mark held his breath. The motel was nearly empty, the kind of place where people minded their own business. He crept toward the door, placing his ear against the wood. Nothing. Then, the doorknob twisted. Panic surged through his veins. He stepped back, gun raised, as the door creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway. She was in her early 30s, her dark hair pulled back, eyes sharp with something between fear and determination. She was dressed in plain jeans and a jacket too thin for the cold night air. "Mark Davies?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His grip on the gun tightened. "Who the hell are you?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "I don't have time to explain. But if you want to live, you need to come with me. Right now." Mark didn't move. His pulse was a thunderous roar in his ears. The woman exhaled sharply. "They found you. Whitmore's men are coming." His blood ran cold. "How do you know?" he asked. The woman swallowed. "Because I used to work for him." Detective Eleanor Walsh sat in the police station's dimly lit office, staring at the charred remains of the phone on her desk. The data extraction had been difficult, but not impossible. The texts were scrambled, much of the memory corrupted from the fire. But they had managed to pull a list of recent calls, one of which led them to a burner phone still active in the outskirts of town. A motel. Walsh drummed her fingers against the desk, thinking. There were two possibilities. One, the owner of the phone was dead, burned along with the rest. Or two, he was alive and running. She glanced at the crime board in front of her. The photographs pinned to it told a horrific story. Smuggling routes crisscrossing the UK, connecting back to names long whispered in underground investigations. And at the center of it all, Liam Carter and Ronald Whitmore. She had been after Whitmore for years. The man was a ghost, his operations sprawling across Europe and Asia. Drugs, weapons, and people, Whitmore trafficked them all. But this time, he had been reckless. He had left a trail. And if Mark Davies was still alive, he might be the key to bringing it all down. Walsh grabbed her coat and her badge. It was time to move. Mark followed the woman through the back alley behind the motel, his breath visible in the frigid air. The streets were quiet, but paranoia gnawed at his nerves. Every shadow felt like a threat. "Where are we going?" he whispered. The woman didn't look back. "Somewhere safe." "Safe?" He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I don't even know who you are." She hesitated before answering. "My name is Julia Reed. I used to work logistics for Whitmore." Mark frowned. "Logistics?" "I tracked shipments, arranged transport, kept the books clean. At least, that's what I thought I was doing." Her voice darkened, until I realized what I was really helping him move. Mark didn't need to ask. He already knew. "Why help me?" he asked instead. Julia glanced at him. "Because you're not like the others." You hesitated. Mark clenched his jaw. He didn't know whether that made him any less guilty. Ahead, Julia stopped beside a rusted sedan parked beneath a flickering streetlight. She pulled out a set of keys. "Get in," she said. Mark hesitated for half a second before slipping into the passenger seat. Julia started the engine and pulled onto the road, keeping the headlights off until they were safely out of sight. As they drove, Mark's mind raced. Whitmore's men were coming for him. The police were likely after him too. There was no way out of this. Unless... He turned to Julia. "You said you worked logistics," he said carefully. "Does that mean you know where the next shipment is?" Julia gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Yes." Mark inhaled sharply. For the first time in hours, he saw a way out. If he could give Walsh what she needed, if he could help bring Whitmore down, maybe, just maybe, he could survive this after all. Julia drove through the desolate roads, her mind calculating every possible outcome of the decision she had just made. The darkness outside felt suffocating, an endless abyss stretching beyond the dim glow of the car's dashboard. She knew this wasn't just about saving Mark Davies, it was about survival. Her own. His. And perhaps, in some twisted sense of redemption, the lives of those who were still trapped within Whitmore's web. Mark sat motionless beside her, his body tense, eyes scanning the road ahead as if expecting headlights to emerge from the void behind them. The weight of their past choices pressed down on them like an invisible force, suffocating and undeniable. They had crossed a threshold, a point of no return, and the only way forward was through the storm of consequences that awaited them. Julia had spent years weaving through Whitmore's network, moving assets, cleaning money, erasing trails. She had been meticulous, always ensuring that nothing could be traced back to her. But in the process, she had ignored the ghosts, the lives destroyed, the faces of the forgotten souls trapped in the underbelly of the operation. Now those ghosts screamed in her mind, demanding justice, retribution, or perhaps just acknowledgement that they had ever existed at all. She had seen the lists, the ledgers filled with nameless figures identified only by numbers, their worth measured in currency rather than humanity. She had ignored them once, but not anymore. The road stretched on, each passing mile marking a countdown to an uncertain future. The weight of the phone in her pocket was a reminder of what lay ahead. Inside, a series of numbers, locations, schedules, everything the authorities needed to bring the empire crashing down. But with that information came danger. Whitmore's men were ruthless, and the moment they realized she was missing, they would come looking. Mark, though silent, was calculating his own path. He had been complicit, tangled in the web of crime by his own choices. He had not trafficked anyone, had not pulled the trigger, but he had known. He had turned a blind eye for too long, telling himself it was just another job, another paycheck, another night where he could silence the guilt with whiskey and empty reassurances. But now, as the reality of what he had been a part of set in, the pit in his stomach deepened. He knew that he could never undo what had been done. The lives lost, the suffering endured, none of it could be erased. The only thing left was to make sure it ended, even if it meant destroying himself in the process. Julia drove without speaking, her thoughts mirroring his. The world outside was still, eerily silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The farther they got from the city, the darker the roads became, each turn taking them deeper into uncertainty. The safe house wasn't much, a cabin tucked away in the woods, a place meant for brief disappearances, not long-term survival. But it would have to do. As the car rolled to a stop, Julia exhaled, gripping the wheel as she tried to suppress the tremor in her hands. She knew this was only temporary. Sooner or later, the world would catch up to them. Mark stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. The night was colder here, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. He looked around, taking in the isolation, the eerie quiet of the forest surrounding them. There was no escape now, no easy way out. Julia knew what came next. They would regroup, gather their thoughts, and then make their move. The files she had stolen from Whitmore were damning, exposing the full scale of his operations. The names of his buyers, the routes used to smuggle people across borders, the corrupt officials who had turned a blind eye for the right price. It was everything the authorities needed, but getting it into the right hands was another battle entirely. Julia had no illusions about what would happen if Whitmore found them first. There would be no negotiations, no second chances. He didn't leave loose ends, and right now, they were the biggest loose ends he had ever faced. As the night stretched on, she sat by the dim glow of the single lamp in the cabin, staring at the stolen files spread across the table. The truth was there, laid out in black and white, undeniable and horrifying. Mark stood near the window, his eyes locked on the darkness outside. Somewhere out there, Whitmore's men were searching. Somewhere, a clock was ticking down to the moment when their temporary silence would be shattered by the inevitable arrival of those who wanted them dead. For now, they had time, but not much. Julia knew that the next move had to be calculated, precise. One wrong step, and everything they had done so far would be for nothing. The weight of that responsibility pressed against her, suffocating yet necessary. The night dragged on, the only sounds the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the distant rustling of the trees. Every second felt stretched, elongated by the tension that thickened the air. Sleep was not an option. Not yet. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a haunting sound that echoed through the forest. Julia looked at Mark, and in that moment, they both understood the truth they had been avoiding. This wasn't about escape. This was a war, and it had only just begun. Case 2. In the heart of Wisconsin, hidden beneath the facade of a quiet, working-class community, a dark network thrived for years, undetected by the authorities. It was a chillingly well-organized operation, orchestrated by a man named Victor Langley, a name that for many meant nothing, but for the victims who had fallen into his hands, it was synonymous with horror. Victor was not a name that appeared in headlines until the moment his empire crumbled, and the world saw the sheer scale of the operation he had been running. Born in 1963 in a small town outside Milwaukee, Victor had been an unremarkable child. He was raised in a strict household, with a father who worked in construction and a mother who stayed home to care for him and his siblings. There was nothing in his early years that suggested he would one day become the mastermind behind the largest human smuggling operation in Wisconsin's history. By the time he reached adulthood, he had built a reputation as an ambitious and resourceful entrepreneur. On the surface, he was a respected businessman, running a chain of trucking companies that transported goods across the Midwest. However, hidden beneath the surface was something far more sinister, a sophisticated network built to traffic desperate individuals across state lines. The operation began small in the late 1990s. Victor had been approached by an associate, someone who had connections with desperate immigrants looking for passage into the United States. It started as a one-time job, moving a group of 10 people from the southern border to Chicago. The money was good, the risk seemed low, and soon, Victor found himself lured into an industry that thrived in secrecy. He quickly realized that the demand was far greater than he had imagined, and over the years, he expanded his operations beyond just smuggling individuals across borders. He established an entire system where vulnerable men, women, and even children were funneled through Wisconsin and sold into forced labor, prostitution, and servitude. Victor's empire relied on a network of drivers, corrupt officials, and hidden facilities spread across the state. His trucking business was the perfect cover, large, unmarked trailers that could conceal dozens of individuals at a time, moving them from holding sites to their destinations under the guise of transporting agricultural produce or factory goods. He knew how to evade law enforcement, altering routes constantly, bribing key officials, and even employing former military personnel to ensure operations ran smoothly. For years, this operation remained under the radar, with only rumors surfacing among law enforcement about an unseen entity controlling the flow of illegal migration in the region. But as Victor's power grew, so did his arrogance. The scale of his operation became impossible to ignore. Reports of missing persons, unexplained deaths in rural areas, and whispers from survivors who had managed to escape began drawing the attention of federal authorities. However, tracking Victor down was not easy. He rarely handled transactions directly, using intermediaries to conduct deals and ensuring that nothing could be traced back to him. The breakthrough came in 2015, when a routine traffic stop in Madison changed everything. A state trooper pulled over one of Victor's trucks for a minor violation. The driver, nervous and sweating, failed to provide proper documentation, and a strange odor emanated from the back of the truck. Upon inspection, the authorities uncovered a nightmare. Over 30 individuals crammed inside the cargo hold, suffering from dehydration and malnutrition. Some had been in that container for days, having been promised safe passage, but instead subjected to inhumane conditions. The discovery triggered an immediate federal investigation. The people inside the truck were too terrified to speak at first, afraid of what would happen if they cooperated with authorities. But as the investigation deepened, a picture began to form, a network of safe houses, abandoned warehouses, and secret drop-off points that stretched across Wisconsin, all leading back to Victor Langley. For years, he had been meticulous in covering his tracks. He never left paper trails, never used his real name in any illegal dealings, and only communicated through burner phones. But the law was closing in. Surveillance footage from gas stations and toll booths showed Victor meeting with known smugglers. Phone records linked him to traffickers in Texas and California. And most damning of all, the people he had once trusted, his own drivers, warehouse workers, and middlemen, began turning against him in exchange for reduced sentences. The net tightened around Victor, and in 2017, he made a critical mistake. In a desperate attempt to flee, he booked a flight under an alias, intending to escape to Central America. But authorities had been monitoring him closely. As he arrived at the airport, he was met by a team of federal agents who had been tracking his every move. The arrest was swift, but the case was far from over. Investigators now had the monumental task of unraveling an operation that had spanned decades. The media exploded with coverage, exposing the extent of Victor's crimes. He had trafficked thousands of people over the years, exploiting them for profit and leaving countless lives destroyed in his wake. The court proceedings were lengthy, as victim testimonies painted a gruesome picture of what had occurred under his reign. Survivors told stories of forced labor, abuse, and in some cases, disappearances that suggested an even darker reality than what had initially been uncovered. By the time the trial concluded, Victor Langley was handed multiple life sentences, ensuring he would never walk free again. But the scars of his actions remained. The case was a wake-up call for Wisconsin and the nation as a whole, exposing vulnerabilities in border security, the trucking industry, and law enforcement's ability to detect large-scale smuggling operations. Even years later, efforts continued to dismantle the remnants of Victor's empire, searching for individuals still lost in the system he had built. His downfall marked the end of an era, but the fight against human trafficking was far from over. Victor had been just one figure in a much larger global network, one that continued to operate in the shadows, exploiting the desperate and the vulnerable. And for every Victor Langley taken down, there were others ready to take his place. As the investigation into Victor Langley's empire deepened, federal agents realized the full extent of his reach. What had initially seemed like a localized smuggling operation soon revealed itself to be a complex, multi-state network, spanning from the southern border of the United States all the way to remote locations in Wisconsin and beyond. The sheer size of the case meant that multiple agencies were now involved. The FBI, ICE, Homeland Security, and local law enforcement in Wisconsin were all working together to piece together the evidence. Investigators combed through financial records, intercepted communications, and followed every lead that emerged from the testimony of former associates. The puzzle was vast and intricate, with every new discovery exposing yet another hidden layer of Victor's criminal empire. One of the biggest breakthroughs came when agents uncovered a series of storage facilities Victor had leased under different aliases. These locations, scattered across Wisconsin and neighboring states, were far from ordinary. At first glance, they appeared to be abandoned warehouses, but upon closer inspection, they were found to be holding sites for smuggled individuals, places where victims were temporarily housed before being transported to their final destinations. Inside, agents found evidence of just how efficiently Victor had run his operation. Rows of makeshift beds, piles of discarded clothing, and hidden compartments meant to conceal people in case of raids painted a horrifying picture. Surveillance footage retrieved from nearby businesses showed trucks coming and going at odd hours, never staying too long but always carrying cargo, human cargo. The conditions were deplorable, with little access to food, water, or sanitation. For many of the victims, the journey had begun thousands of miles away. Desperate for a better life, they had placed their trust in smugglers who had promised safe passage into the United States. They had paid everything they had, some selling their homes, others borrowing money from dangerous lenders, and many being deceived into thinking they were entering legitimate work contracts. But once in the system, they found themselves trapped, unable to escape, and at the mercy of men like Victor Langley. Some were forced into labor, working in farms, factories, and restaurants where they were paid little to nothing. Others were funneled into more sinister industries, where they were subjected to unspeakable abuse. The lucky ones were eventually discarded, left to wander unfamiliar cities with no identification, no money, and no hope of ever reuniting with their families. Among the most harrowing discoveries was a hidden compound deep in the Wisconsin countryside, a place authorities only found after tracing Victor's financial transactions. It was a sprawling property, surrounded by thick forests and far from prying eyes. When agents arrived, they found it abandoned, but the evidence left behind suggested it had once held dozens, if not hundreds, of victims. There were small, windowless rooms with reinforced locks, remnants of meal rations, and scattered personal belongings, silent reminders of those who had passed through. Investigators knew that dismantling Victor's network would take years, and even with him behind bars, the work was far from over. Many of his associates had fled, disappearing into the shadows before authorities could track them down. Some had already moved on to other trafficking rings, while others had gone into hiding, waiting for the heat to die down before resuming their illicit activities. The case became one of the most significant human trafficking prosecutions in American history. The testimonies of survivors became a crucial part of the proceedings, shedding light on the brutality they had endured. Many spoke of how they had been deceived, how promises of a better future had turned into nightmares, and how they had been forced to work under inhumane conditions with no way out. In the courtroom, Victor remained eerily calm. He listened as witness after witness described the horrors they had suffered under his operation, but there was no remorse in his eyes. He had built an empire on the suffering of others, and even in the face of overwhelming evidence, he refused to acknowledge the full extent of his crimes. The sentencing was swift and severe. Given the number of charges against him, including human trafficking, money laundering, conspiracy, and multiple violations of federal law, Victor Langley was sentenced to multiple life terms, ensuring he would never be free again. But for many, justice did not erase the scars. Families who had lost loved ones to Victor's operation still searched for closure, while survivors struggled to rebuild their lives. The case had exposed not just the crimes of one man, but the failings of a system that had allowed such atrocities to occur for so long. As the years passed, efforts to combat human trafficking intensified, with authorities using Victor's case as a blueprint to identify and dismantle similar networks. Yet, the fight was far from over. The demand for cheap labor and illicit services continued to fuel the industry, and for every trafficker caught, others emerged to take their place. The story of Victor Langley served as a grim reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of society. His empire had fallen, but the battle against human trafficking was a war that would never truly end. The unraveling of Victor Langley's empire did not happen overnight. It was a painstaking process that required relentless effort from law enforcement, investigative journalists, and even former victims who dared to come forward despite the immense risk. The deeper the authorities dug, the more sinister the operation appeared. Victor had not always been the cold, calculating mastermind behind one of the largest human smuggling rings in U.S. history. He had started small, just another middleman in the vast underground network that facilitated illegal immigration. At first, he worked under more experienced traffickers, learning the trade and understanding the weaknesses in the system. But Victor was different from the rest. He was ambitious, intelligent, and utterly ruthless. While others saw human smuggling as a dangerous yet profitable endeavor, Victor viewed it as a business, one that could be scaled and optimized like any legitimate corporation. He studied supply chains, figured out how to minimize risk, and built layers of protection between himself and the crimes he orchestrated. By the early 2000s, he had broken away from his mentors and established his own network, operating out of the Midwest. Unlike the traditional cartels that controlled human trafficking along the southern border, Victor's operation specialized in moving people further inland, past the scrutiny of border patrols and major metropolitan police forces. He realized that once individuals were deep inside the country, they became invisible, ghosts who had no documentation, no legal standing, and no way to seek help. Wisconsin became his primary hub. Its vast, rural landscapes provided the perfect cover for his operations. He purchased multiple properties, some under fake identities, others through shell corporations, where he could temporarily house and process smuggled individuals before dispersing them to their final destinations. But this was not just about moving people. Victor found ways to monetize every step of the process. He charged families exorbitant fees to smuggle their relatives into the U.S., only to demand even more money once they arrived. Those who could not pay were forced into labor, working in farms, factories, and restaurants that operated as part of his shadow economy. For years, law enforcement struggled to pin anything substantial on Victor. He was meticulous in covering his tracks, using encrypted communication, disposable burner phones, and a network of intermediaries who handled the dirty work. Those who betrayed him or posed a threat had a way of disappearing, their fates never fully known. The turning point in the investigation came when an unexpected witness emerged, one who had been deeply embedded in Victor's organization. This was a man known only as Daniel in court records, a former enforcer who had spent years working for Victor before growing disillusioned with the brutality of the operation. Daniel had seen firsthand how people were treated as commodities, their fates decided by nothing more than their ability to generate profit. He had witnessed the horrors of the holding facilities, where individuals were crammed into small, windowless rooms, awaiting their uncertain futures. Some were sold into forced labor, others into even darker markets. Those who resisted or tried to escape were dealt with harshly, beaten, starved, or worse. With Daniel's testimony, investigators finally had a roadmap to Victor's operation. He provided details on transportation routes, safe houses, and key figures within the network. Based on his information, federal agents launched a series of coordinated raids across multiple states, shutting down Victor's storage facilities and rescuing dozens of victims. One of the most shocking discoveries was a hidden compound deep in the Wisconsin woods. It was a heavily fortified structure, surrounded by high fences and patrolled by armed guards. Inside, agents found more than 40 people, men, women, and even children, who had been held there for weeks, awaiting their final assignments. Some were malnourished, their bodies showing signs of abuse. Others were too afraid to speak, their eyes hollow from years of being treated as less than human. Investigators found ledgers detailing payments and destinations, proving that Victor's operation extended far beyond what they had initially suspected. With overwhelming evidence against him, Victor Langley was finally brought to trial. The case attracted national attention, shining a spotlight on the hidden world of human trafficking within the United States. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of a man who had built an empire on suffering, exploiting the most vulnerable for his own gain. Survivors took the stand, their testimonies exposing the horrors they had endured. One woman recounted how she had been promised a job as a nanny, only to be forced into servitude in a wealthy household, working long hours with no pay. Another man described how he had been locked in a basement for weeks, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. Throughout the proceedings, Victor remained emotionless. He did not react as evidence was presented, nor did he flinch as former associates testified against him. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, and even as the walls closed in, he refused to acknowledge the full weight of his crimes. In the end, the jury found him guilty on multiple charges, including human trafficking, conspiracy, and financial crimes. The judge handed down the maximum sentence, ensuring Victor would never walk free again. But while Victor was gone, the scars of his crimes remained. Many of his victims struggled to rebuild their lives, their trauma too deep to simply erase. Some had lost everything, their families, their identities, even their sense of self. Law enforcement agencies used the case as a blueprint to dismantle similar operations across the country. However, they knew that the fight against human trafficking was far from over. For every Victor Langley brought to justice, there were others waiting in the shadows, ready to take his place. The case became a symbol of both the darkness and resilience of the human spirit. It exposed the hidden underbelly of society, where the most vulnerable were exploited for profit. But it also showcased the determination of those who refused to look away, who fought to bring the truth to light no matter the cost. And so, even as Victor Langley faded into obscurity within the walls of a maximum security prison, the battle against human trafficking raged on, a war that would never truly end. The conviction of Victor Langley marked a significant victory in the fight against human trafficking, but for those who had been caught in his web, the scars ran far deeper than any court ruling could heal. The legal system could punish a man, but it could not undo the years of torment, exploitation, and suffering he had orchestrated. For many of Victor's victims, freedom was not the end of their struggle. It was the beginning of a different kind of battle. The people rescued from his operations had spent months, even years, living in fear, stripped of their identities and rights. Some had been trafficked so young that they barely remembered a life before captivity. Others had risked everything to come to the United States, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare far worse than what they had fled from. Many had no legal status, no family to return to, and no means of survival. The government provided some assistance, temporary shelters, legal aid, and therapy, but these resources were limited. Without documentation or a support system, reintegration into society was nearly impossible. Some were forced to live in secret, terrified of being deported. Others fell back into the very cycle of exploitation they had tried to escape. One of the most haunting discoveries in Victor's ledgers was a section labeled "Disappeared," a list of names without assigned destinations. Investigators feared these individuals had met a much darker fate. Some might have been trafficked into illicit industries that were even harder to trace. Others may have been silenced permanently, their bodies discarded in places where no one would ever find them. Even as authorities celebrated Victor's conviction, a grim reality settled in. His operation was merely one branch of a vast and insidious network. While he had built one of the largest smuggling rings in the Midwest, he was not the only one. And worse, his downfall created a vacuum, one that others were eager to fill. Federal agents did not stop with Victor's arrest. His trial had uncovered new leads, revealing just how deeply entrenched human trafficking was within the country's underground economy. Using the documents recovered from his compound, investigators traced connections to businesses, corrupt officials, and even seemingly legitimate corporations that had unknowingly, or knowingly, benefited from his operation. One name that surfaced repeatedly was Marshall and Levinson Freight Company, a major transportation company based in Illinois. On paper, the company specialized in commercial shipping, moving goods across state lines. But according to Victor's records, their trucks had also been used to transport people. They had modified trailers with hidden compartments, designed to smuggle large numbers of individuals without detection. Undercover agents infiltrated the company, posing as drivers and warehouse workers. What they found was damning: fraudulent manifests, bribes paid to inspectors, and routes designed to bypass immigration checkpoints. It was clear that Marshall and Levinson was not just complicit, they were actively involved. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that Victor's empire had not been built in isolation. He had relied on a network of facilitators, many of whom had continued their operations even after his arrest. Some had gone underground, switching to more discreet methods. Others had simply rebranded, taking advantage of the chaos left in Victor's wake. Victor had been smart about creating redundancies in his system. While most smuggling routes into the U.S. were heavily monitored, especially those along the southern border, he had pioneered alternative pathways. One such route became known as the Northern Passage. Instead of bringing people directly from Mexico into the U.S., he had arranged for them to be transported through Canada first. From there, they would enter the U.S. through remote border crossings, where security was more lax. The journey was brutal. Many of the people smuggled through this route had to trek for miles through freezing temperatures, their bodies unprepared for the harsh climate. Some didn't survive the crossing. Their bodies were rarely found, swallowed by the vast, uninhabited wilderness. But the most shocking revelation was that this method had been in use for years, long before Victor had perfected it. The documents seized from his compound included records dating back nearly a decade, detailing thousands of individuals who had entered the U.S. through this clandestine route. The downfall of one kingpin did not mean the end of the trade. In fact, as Victor sat behind bars, his former associates scrambled to take control of the remnants of his empire. Some were former lieutenants, men who had worked closely with him and knew the business inside out. Others were rival traffickers, eager to absorb his networks and expand their own reach. Law enforcement officials found themselves in a race against time. Every day that passed allowed these new players to gain a stronger foothold. They launched sting operations, raided suspected safe houses, and tracked financial transactions. But the reality was that the system itself was broken. For every operation they dismantled, another one emerged elsewhere. The demand for cheap labor, for illicit services, for desperate people willing to take unimaginable risks, this demand never disappeared. And so, while Victor Langley had been defeated, the war raged on. Long after Victor was sentenced, his name remained a whispered legend among those still trapped in the underworld of human trafficking. For some, he was a cautionary tale, a warning of what happened to those who flew too close to the sun. For others, he was a martyr, proof that the system could crush anyone, no matter how powerful they seemed. But for his victims, he was something else entirely. He was the man who had stolen their lives, who had turned their dreams into nightmares. And while he rotted in prison, many of them still struggled to piece together the fragments of their stolen pasts. Some found solace in advocacy, turning their pain into action. They spoke at rallies, lobbied for stronger anti-trafficking laws, and worked with organizations dedicated to helping survivors. But others were not so lucky. Many disappeared into the margins of society, too broken to rebuild, too lost to be found. Some turned to crime, mimicking the very system that had once enslaved them. Others simply faded away, their stories untold, their fates unknown. The story of Victor Langley was not just the story of a man. It was the story of a world that thrived on the suffering of the unseen. And though his reign had ended, the cycle continued, as it always had, lurking beneath the surface of a world that preferred to look the other way. The aftermath of Victor Langley's downfall was far from a clean resolution. The trafficking network he had constructed did not simply vanish upon his imprisonment. Instead, it splintered into fragments, each taking on a life of its own. Some of his former associates fled underground, dissolving their former connections and disappearing into obscurity. Others seized the opportunity to fill the void, vying for control over the remnants of his empire. For law enforcement, the fight was far from over. As they continued their pursuit of the criminals who had enabled Victor's operations, they began to uncover deeper layers of corruption and complicity. It was no longer just a matter of taking down individual traffickers. The system itself had become a tangled web of enablers, from business owners to corrupt officials, from fraudulent agencies to the silent benefactors who profited from the cheap labor Victor's victims provided. Investigators followed the money trail, tracing bribes, offshore accounts, and forged documents that had allowed Victor's empire to thrive undetected for so long. Among the most alarming discoveries was the involvement of several government officials. People who had been entrusted with upholding the law, yet had actively facilitated the trafficking ring's expansion. One of the most notorious among them was Michael Henshaw, a senior immigration officer based in Chicago. Henshaw had been instrumental in providing fraudulent documentation, allowing hundreds of trafficked individuals to pass through the system undetected. In return, he had received lucrative payments, laundered through offshore shell companies. Henshaw had operated with near total impunity for years. He had buried reports, falsified records, and even redirected investigations that came too close to exposing the truth. His downfall was triggered by a single oversight, a bank transaction linked to Victor's network that had been flagged by a persistent financial analyst. The arrest of Henshaw sent shockwaves through law enforcement circles. He had been a respected figure, someone who had publicly championed efforts against illegal immigration while secretly profiting from it. His trial revealed damning testimony from trafficked individuals who recalled his name appearing in discussions about their forged papers, as well as from junior officers who had unknowingly processed documents he had approved. But Henshaw was only the beginning. The investigation uncovered a network of officials, from border patrol agents to city administrators, who had either turned a blind eye or actively participated in the operation. Some had been bribed, others had been threatened, and many had simply seen it as an opportunity to make money, rationalizing their actions as just another transaction in a world that already ran on corruption. As the authorities scrambled to dismantle what remained of Victor's operation, a new concern emerged. What had happened to the people still trapped within the network? The names in Victor's ledgers accounted for thousands of individuals, but not all had been recovered. Survivors who had managed to escape spoke of lost routes, smuggling paths that had been abandoned or rerouted in the wake of Victor's arrest. Some had been left stranded in safe houses, with no money, no identification, and no means of returning home. Others had been quickly sold off to other trafficking networks before the authorities could intervene. One such case involved a group of 37 individuals, all originally trafficked from Eastern Europe, who had been held in a warehouse outside of Milwaukee. They had been awaiting transport when Victor's arrest had disrupted the operation. The traffickers, desperate to avoid detection, had abandoned them in a locked storage facility without food or water. By the time authorities discovered them, several had already succumbed to dehydration. The survivors were barely conscious, their bodies weakened from weeks of malnutrition and abuse. Among them were children, some as young as 7, who had been separated from their families and had no idea where they were or why they had been taken. The discovery of the warehouse was a grim reminder that Victor's empire was never just about him. It was a massive, sprawling network that had ensnared countless lives. And while Victor sat in a prison cell, many of his victims remained trapped, their fates uncertain. The legal proceedings that followed Victor's arrest stretched on for years. Dozens of his associates faced prosecution, from the men who had operated his transport routes to the accountants who had laundered his money. But while the justice system worked to hold the perpetrators accountable, the survivors were left to navigate a world that had largely failed them. Many had no legal status, no documentation, and no access to basic resources. Some were placed in shelters, where they lived in limbo, uncertain of what their futures held. Others faced deportation, sent back to the very countries they had tried to escape from. The trauma of their experiences lingered. Some could not speak of what had happened to them, unable to process the horrors they had endured. Others attempted to rebuild their lives, but the scars, both physical and emotional, were permanent. For those who had profited from Victor's operation, the consequences were often minimal. Some of his wealthiest clients, the ones who had benefited from cheap labor and illicit services, remained untouched. They had been careful, insulating themselves behind layers of legal protection, ensuring that their names never appeared in the official records. Even as Victor's case faded from the headlines, human trafficking remained a thriving industry. The demand had not disappeared, and new traffickers had already begun to rise, adapting to the lessons learned from Victor's mistakes. Despite the victories in court, law enforcement officials knew that they had only scratched the surface of a much larger problem. The structures that had allowed Victor's empire to flourish were still in place, waiting for the next opportunist to exploit them. The cycle continued. The desperate still sought a way to escape their circumstances, and there would always be those willing to prey on their vulnerabilities. The smuggling routes would be redrawn, the bribery networks re-established, and the demand for human exploitation would persist. Victor Langley was gone, but the world that had created him remained unchanged. And as long as there was profit to be made from the suffering of others, there would always be another trafficker ready to take his place. Case 3. Under the relentless sun of Arizona's vast and unforgiving deserts, a man named Victor Salazar built an empire that thrived in the shadows. Born in 1971 to a struggling immigrant family in Tucson, Victor had learned from an early age how to navigate the fine line between survival and ambition. By his late 20s, he had established himself as a key figure in the underground world of human smuggling, orchestrating operations that spanned from Central America to the United States. Victor was not an ordinary smuggler. He was a strategist, a manipulator, and above all, a businessman. Unlike the violent cartels that dominated drug trafficking, his network relied on calculated moves, deception, and a network of well-placed informants and corrupt officials. He understood the desperation of those fleeing poverty and violence in their home countries, and he monetized their hope with precision. His operation became known as the Phantom Passage, a smuggling ring so elusive that even law enforcement struggled to track its movements. At the height of his reign, Victor employed a sophisticated system of transport routes, safe houses, and forged documentation, allowing thousands of migrants to cross into the United States undetected. He formed alliances with local gangs, law enforcement officers on the take, and logistics experts who ensured that every crossing was meticulously planned. His network used everything from modified freight trucks with hidden compartments to remote hiking trails through the Sonoran Desert, where smugglers guided migrants under the cover of night. His most ambitious plan came in the summer of 2012, when Victor orchestrated what would later be known as the largest human smuggling case in Arizona's history. It was a logistical nightmare, transporting over 200 individuals across the border in a single operation. To pull it off, he needed to leverage every connection, every bribe, and every trick he had mastered over the years. The plan involved multiple transport layers, a mix of fake humanitarian aid convoys, concealed compartments in semi-trucks, and temporary holding locations in abandoned desert properties. For weeks, his lieutenants worked tirelessly, organizing groups, securing forged travel documents, and ensuring that the routes were clear of patrols. The most dangerous stretch was the unforgiving Arizona desert, where extreme temperatures and dehydration posed deadly risks. Victor's network had stationed water caches, medical supplies, and emergency shelters in strategic locations, ensuring that the migrants could survive the grueling journey. The night of the operation, everything seemed to be running smoothly. The first wave of transports successfully crossed into U.S. territory, with agents and lookouts reporting minimal border patrol presence. Using decoy vehicles to draw attention away from the real cargo, Victor's team managed to evade authorities in a way that seemed almost effortless. However, what he didn't anticipate was the sudden shift in border security operations. The U.S. Border Patrol had been tightening its surveillance along the Arizona corridor due to a recent intelligence leak about increased smuggling activity. Unbeknownst to Victor, a federal task force had already been monitoring his network for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. The scale of his operation was what ultimately betrayed him. Moving such a large number of people at once raised red flags in law enforcement databases. Before dawn, the first transport vehicle was intercepted near Yuma. Packed with over 50 migrants in suffocating conditions, the truck driver attempted to flee, but was quickly apprehended. Within hours, more vehicles were stopped along major highways, leading to a chain reaction that unraveled the entire operation. Victor, watching from a safe distance in Phoenix, knew that his empire was collapsing in real time. The radio silence from his transport teams, the sudden movement of unmarked government vehicles near his safe houses, and the panicked calls from his associates confirmed the inevitable. The Phantom Passage, an empire built on secrecy and manipulation, was finally exposed. As dawn broke over the Arizona desert, the largest crackdown on human smuggling in the state's history was underway. But Victor wasn't ready to give up just yet. Victor Salazar had always been prepared for worst-case scenarios. He had contingency plans, fake identities, and offshore accounts that allowed him to disappear at a moment's notice. But as the hours passed and the news reports flooded in, he realized that this time was different. The sheer scale of the bust meant that law enforcement was not just making arrests. They were dismantling his empire piece by piece. The first major blow came when his top lieutenant, Marco Velasquez, was captured in a sting operation outside of Tucson. Marco had been the logistical mastermind behind the smuggling routes, overseeing transport operations and ensuring that vehicles were never overloaded to avoid detection. His arrest was a devastating loss, not only because of his knowledge, but because Marco had never been the kind of man who could withstand pressure. Victor knew that once interrogated, Marco would start talking. Meanwhile, raids were being conducted at safe houses across the state. Warehouses in Phoenix, abandoned motels in Nogales, and remote desert hideouts were all targeted. Dozens of migrants were found in overcrowded rooms, waiting for their next transport out of Arizona. Some were dehydrated, others barely conscious from heat exhaustion. Their testimonies painted a chilling picture of a network that had operated in the shadows for years, promising them a better life, but often delivering them into perilous conditions. The federal task force leading the investigation was relentless. They had been tracking Victor's movements for months, gathering intelligence through wiretaps, informants, and satellite surveillance. His operation had been one of the most sophisticated smuggling rings in modern history, but now it was crumbling. The press was already calling it the largest human trafficking bust in Arizona's history, and the Department of Homeland Security had made it a top priority. Victor's next move was critical. He had managed to escape Phoenix before law enforcement closed in on his properties, using an alternate identity and a network of corrupt officials who owed him favors. He drove south toward the border, where he had one last chance to disappear, into Mexico, where he could lay low and rebuild. He knew the risks. Crossing into Mexico would mean relying on the very cartels he had worked so hard to avoid. Unlike his carefully crafted smuggling routes, the cartel-controlled territories were unpredictable and ruthless. As he neared the border, he could feel the weight of years of deception catching up with him. His empire had been built on secrecy, but now, every road he took seemed to be a dead end. Checkpoints had been tightened, facial recognition cameras were scanning major highways, and federal agents were working with local police to track down every last piece of his network. In desperation, he reached out to one of his last remaining allies, a man known only as El Pastor, a high-ranking figure in the Sinaloa cartel who had occasionally facilitated crossings for Victor's more high-profile clients. But El Pastor had little patience for fugitives. The moment Victor contacted him, he knew he was no longer an asset, he was a liability. By the time Victor reached the outskirts of Nogales, he noticed that something was off. A black SUV had been trailing him for miles, never getting too close but never disappearing from view. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he approached a deserted gas station. If they were federal agents, they wouldn't make a move in public. But if they were cartel enforcers, he wouldn't even make it out of the car alive. The SUV pulled up alongside him. A man in dark sunglasses stepped out, his expression unreadable. For the first time in his life, Victor felt truly cornered. His empire was gone, his allies had abandoned him, and now, standing at the edge of the desert he had once controlled, he realized there was nowhere left to run. The desert night was eerily silent as Victor Salazar sat motionless in his car, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. The man who had stepped out of the black SUV remained still, watching him with a gaze that felt more like a judgment than a threat. Victor had spent decades making calculated decisions, but at that moment, he realized that no amount of planning had prepared him for this. His first instinct was to reach for the gun tucked beneath his seat, but he knew that would be a death sentence. If the man outside was with law enforcement, drawing a weapon would mean a swift execution. If he was with the cartel, any act of aggression would guarantee a slow, agonizing demise. Either way, he had lost control of the situation. Victor took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. He slowly pushed the car door open, stepping out onto the cracked pavement of the deserted gas station. The desert air was thick with heat, even though the sun had long since disappeared beyond the horizon. He forced himself to meet the stranger's gaze, searching for any sign of recognition, any indication of who he was dealing with. The man in sunglasses remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking. His voice was low, measured, almost disinterested. Victor knew better than to respond with arrogance. Instead, he played the only card he had left, cooperation. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the situation without outright admitting defeat. The man didn't react immediately. He simply turned, gesturing toward the SUV. The message was clear. Get in. Victor hesitated for only a fraction of a second before complying. He had no other choice. He climbed into the back seat, feeling the chill of the leather against his skin despite the lingering heat of the night. The moment the door shut behind him, the vehicle began moving, pulling away from the gas station and into the endless darkness of the Arizona desert. The silence in the car was suffocating. Victor could hear the sound of his own breathing, the steady hum of the tires against the road, the occasional rustle of fabric as one of the men shifted in his seat. No one spoke. No one needed to. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. They drove for what felt like hours, the landscape outside growing increasingly barren. Victor had spent years traversing the smuggling routes of Arizona, and he knew exactly where they were headed. The outskirts of Nogales, deep into the cartel-controlled territories. When the car finally slowed to a stop, Victor's pulse quickened. He was pulled from the vehicle and led toward a dimly lit structure. A warehouse, its exterior worn from years of neglect. The scent of oil and sweat filled the air as they entered. Inside, a handful of men stood waiting, their faces partially obscured by the dim lighting. And then Victor saw him. El Pastor. The cartel figure stood at the center of the room, dressed in a simple white button-down shirt, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His presence alone was enough to command attention, his every movement deliberate, controlled. Victor had dealt with him before, but never like this. Their previous meetings had always been on neutral ground, their business transactions precise and efficient. But now Victor wasn't a partner, he was a fugitive, a liability. El Pastor regarded him for a long moment before finally speaking. The words sent a chill down Victor's spine. This was worse than he had imagined. He wasn't here to negotiate for his freedom. He was here to be judged. Victor had spent his life manipulating others, staying one step ahead of the law, the cartels, even his own people. But now, in the heart of the very world he had profited from, he was completely at their mercy. The realization was suffocating. As El Pastor stepped forward, the other men in the room tensed, waiting for their leader's command. The air was thick with unspoken consequences. Victor had seen men disappear in places like this. He had orchestrated disappearances himself, and now he was the one with nowhere left to run. The dim overhead light flickered, casting shifting shadows across the cold concrete floor. Victor's breathing was shallow, measured. Years of experience had taught him that any sign of weakness could be fatal. He forced himself to meet El Pastor's gaze, though every fiber of his being screamed at him to look away. The cartel leader's eyes held no emotion, just an unwavering scrutiny that felt more like a death sentence than an interrogation. Victor knew the game. He had played it for decades. But this time, the board had shifted, and he was no longer the one in control. El Pastor didn't need to speak to command authority. His presence alone was enough to dictate every movement in the room. The men surrounding them stood still, awaiting orders. No one moved unless he allowed it. The air in the warehouse was heavy with the metallic scent of oil, rust, and something far more sinister, something Victor refused to acknowledge. A single nod from El Pastor, and one of his men stepped forward, placing a thick manila folder onto the table between them. Victor didn't have to look to know what it contained. Names, dates, routes, perhaps even photos of people who had paid for passage across the border. People whose lives now hung in the balance because of a single betrayal. Victor knew what this was. A trial. El Pastor finally spoke, his voice steady, deliberate, devoid of any unnecessary emotion. Victor's mind worked rapidly. There was no denying what had happened. The feds had closed in faster than expected, and his own men had made mistakes. But admitting failure wasn't an option. Not here. Not now. The cartel leader let the silence stretch, waiting for an answer. Victor knew better than to plead. Begging wouldn't save him. He had seen it happen before. Men who tried to justify their actions, who thought explanations could outweigh consequences. They were all gone now, their voices silenced long before they could finish speaking. He took a slow breath and responded in the only way he could. He needed a solution. Now, the problem wasn't just law enforcement. Someone inside his network was either incompetent or actively betraying him. He thought back to the last few weeks. Routes that should have been secure suddenly compromised. Deals that should have gone smoothly unraveling without explanation. A rat. There had to be a rat. His eyes scanned the room, settling on each of the men who had pledged loyalty to him. Any one of them could be feeding information to the authorities. Any one of them could be the reason his empire was crumbling. Miguel re-entered the room, his face tense. The police had already started questioning the migrants they had captured. It was only a matter of time before they got something useful. Names, locations, anything that could lead them back to Victor. He didn't have time to wait. Victor grabbed his jacket and motioned for Miguel to follow. They had to get ahead of this. If law enforcement was closing in, he needed to know what they knew. He needed to shut this down before it spread any further. The two men climbed into an SUV, speeding off into the darkness. They had a long night ahead of them. Case 4. In the humid, dense jungles of Cambodia, where the Mekong River winds through ancient temples and forgotten villages, a sinister network thrived in the shadows. The year was 2016, a time when economic instability and the promise of a better life lured thousands into the hands of traffickers who promised them freedom, but instead delivered them into servitude. At the center of this vast operation stood a man named Somchai Virak, a figure as elusive as the mist that clung to the Cambodian forests. Born into a modest family in Phnom Penh, Somchai had spent his early years working along the bustling river ports. His father, a fisherman, had tried to instill in him an honest life, but the lure of easy money in the underworld was too strong. By his late teens, Somchai was already involved in smuggling contraband across the borders of Thailand and Vietnam. He understood the labyrinthine routes, the bribable officials, and the desperation of those willing to take risks. He had no moral qualms about trading in anything that could turn a profit, whether it was illegal timber, rare animal species, or, eventually, human lives. His operation started small, taking a few desperate individuals across the border to Thailand for work in sweatshops and construction sites. But as demand grew, so did his ambition. By 2010, he had cultivated an intricate network that spanned Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and even the far reaches of Malaysia. His men operated in silence, using dilapidated fishing boats, hidden truck compartments, and even tunnels beneath the border crossings. The promise of jobs in prosperous cities was an irresistible bait for those who had no other way out. But it wasn't just the poor who fell into his trap. University graduates, young professionals, and entire families were drawn in by the false promises. Samkai's recruiters were well-trained, targeting people through fake job agencies and social media ads that offered positions in hotels, casinos, and factories. Some willingly paid the initial transport fees, thinking they were investing in their future. Others were taken outright, kidnapped from bus stations, night markets, and remote villages where law enforcement had little reach. Once under his control, their fates were sealed. Many were forced into debt bondage, working under inhumane conditions to repay the ever-growing costs of their transportation and lodging. Women were sold into underground brothels, while men labored in sweatshops or on fishing boats that never returned to shore. Those who resisted were met with violence, beaten, starved, or worse. Despite the growing suspicions of authorities, Samchai was nearly untouchable. He had high-ranking officials in his pocket, and his operations were masked under legitimate businesses. He funded schools, built temples, and donated generously to local charities, creating an image of a philanthropist who cared for his people. The truth, however, was far darker. For years, whispers of missing people and unmarked graves surfaced in local newspapers, but investigations always stalled. Witnesses disappeared, evidence vanished, and those who dared to speak out found themselves facing threats or sudden accidents. Samchai was careful, ensuring that every loose end was tied before it could unravel. But the cracks in his empire were beginning to show. In 2015, an investigative journalist named Dara Mies began connecting the dots. She had spent years tracking the patterns of disappearances and had uncovered links between Samkai's so-called businesses and the underworld of human trafficking. Unlike others before her, Dara had something Samkai's victims never had: connections, resources, and a determination that could not be silenced. And then a single mistake set everything in motion. The mistake that would unravel years of careful deception was, at first, something seemingly insignificant. A single transport vehicle, a repurposed freight truck, had veered off course near the Cambodian-Vietnamese border. Normally, Samkai's network functioned with ruthless efficiency. Routes were meticulously planned, drivers knew which checkpoints to avoid, and border officials were paid handsomely to turn a blind eye. But on this particular night, something went wrong. The truck had been carrying 32 people, men, women, and children, bound for labor camps in Malaysia. Samkai's usual drivers were experienced, knowing how to navigate rough terrain and avoid unwanted attention. But this particular vehicle had been assigned to a lower-level operative, someone desperate to prove their worth in the organization. Instead of sticking to the designated smuggling path, he had deviated, thinking he could save time. The truck was found abandoned in a secluded clearing, its cargo doors flung open. Some of the captives had escaped, fleeing into the dense jungle, while others remained inside, too weak from dehydration and exhaustion to run. When local authorities arrived, alerted by a group of farmers who had seen the vehicle earlier that morning, they were horrified by what they found. The people inside were malnourished, their bodies bearing signs of prolonged abuse. The air reeked of sweat, urine, and fear. News of the discovery spread quickly, and soon, it reached the ears of Dara Measure. The journalist had been following the breadcrumbs of Samkai's empire for months, but until now, she had only fragments of evidence, disjointed reports, missing person cases, and whispers from terrified families who had lost loved ones. This truck, however, was undeniable proof. Dara wasted no time. She contacted international human rights organizations, sharing what she had uncovered. With their help, she traced the vehicle's registration back to a shell company owned by none other than Samchai Virak. It was the breakthrough she had been waiting for, but she knew that exposing Samchai would not be easy. He had evaded authorities for years, leaving no direct link between himself and the crimes committed under his command. His wealth insulated him, his influence stretched far beyond Cambodia's borders, and his network operated like a well-oiled machine. Yet, this time, things were different. The victims found in the truck were willing to speak, and their testimonies painted a chilling picture. They described being lured with promises of jobs in neighboring countries, only to be stripped of their passports and forced into labor. Some had been working for years, never seeing a single payment, while others had watched their fellow captives die from disease, starvation, or beatings. As more details emerged, international pressure mounted. Humanitarian organizations called for an investigation, and foreign embassies demanded answers. The Cambodian government, long accused of turning a blind eye to trafficking operations, could no longer ignore the growing outcry. Somchai, sensing the walls closing in, made a crucial mistake. He panicked. Instead of lying low, he began moving his assets, shutting down warehouses, and eliminating anyone who might betray him. This only drew more attention to his activities. The more he tried to cover his tracks, the more evidence surfaced. Then came the raid. Acting on intelligence gathered from Dara and other whistleblowers, a joint task force was assembled. Cambodian authorities, working alongside international agencies, coordinated a massive sting operation. Under the cover of darkness, elite units stormed one of Somchai's primary compounds, a sprawling estate hidden deep in the jungle. What they found there was worse than anyone had imagined. The estate was a fortress, hidden beneath layers of dense foliage, its perimeter lined with barbed wire and armed guards. It was not just a simple hideout. It was a fully operational hub where victims were sorted, detained, and transported to various destinations across Southeast Asia. The raid began just before dawn, when the jungle was still cloaked in darkness. The task force moved in with silent precision, careful to avoid setting off alarms. But Somchai's men were no amateurs. They had been trained for situations like this. The moment the first breach was made, chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the trees. The thick, humid air was filled with shouting and the pounding of boots on the ground. Armed guards, many of them former soldiers or mercenaries, fought back fiercely. They knew the stakes. If captured, they would not walk free again. Inside the compound, dozens of captives huddled in makeshift cells, their bodies weak from malnutrition and abuse. Some had been locked away for months, their spirits broken. Others had only just arrived, their eyes still filled with fear and confusion. As the fighting raged outside, a team of operatives forced their way into the underground chambers. What they found there was far worse than anything they had imagined. The tunnels beneath the estate stretched for miles, a labyrinth of filth and suffering. Victims were crammed into tiny cages, their hands and feet shackled, their voices hoarse from screaming for help that never came. Some were children, barely old enough to understand the horrors they had been subjected to. The stench of human waste, rot, and despair was suffocating. One of the rescuers later described the scene as something out of a nightmare. Rows of bodies, some barely breathing, some lifeless, their eyes vacant and hollow. The operation lasted for hours, but by sunrise, the compound was secure. More than 100 people were freed, and dozens of Somchai's men were either dead or in custody. But Somchai himself was nowhere to be found. The kingpin had vanished. It was as if he had evaporated into the jungle, leaving behind only the wreckage of his empire. Investigators found evidence of an escape route, a hidden passage leading deep into the forest, littered with discarded weapons and supplies. He had been prepared for this moment. For days, authorities scoured the jungle, tracking every lead, following every possible route he could have taken. But he was always one step ahead, slipping through their grasp like a ghost. Some believed he had fled to Thailand, where corrupt officials could provide him safe passage. Others suspected he had gone underground, using his vast network of contacts to hide in plain sight. Weeks passed, then months, and still, there was no trace of Somchai Virak. His empire had crumbled, his men were either imprisoned or dead, yet he remained a phantom, an enigma lost in the shadows. But his story was far from over. Even in his absence, the wounds he had inflicted remained. The survivors, though freed from their cages, carried scars that would never heal. Many had no families to return to, no homes to call their own. They had been stolen, erased from existence, and now they had to rebuild their lives from nothing. Dara Mies, the journalist who had first exposed Somchai's operation, continued to pursue the truth. She documented the testimonies of the victims, shedding light on the horrors they had endured. Her work brought international attention to Cambodia's trafficking crisis, sparking outrage and demands for reform. Yet, despite all the progress made, one truth remained: Somchai was still out there. And as long as he was free, the darkness he had created would never fully fade. The search for Somchai Virak had become one of the most extensive manhunts in Southeast Asian history. The Cambodian authorities, backed by international agencies, worked tirelessly to track down the elusive mastermind behind one of the largest human trafficking rings in modern history. His empire had crumbled, but the ghosts of his crimes still haunted the survivors, and as long as he remained free, the justice system felt incomplete. Interpol had issued a red notice, and his face was plastered across international media. But it seemed that Somchai had vanished into thin air. Investigators speculated that he had fled the country through a network of smugglers, using the same illicit routes he had once controlled. Some believed he had found refuge in Thailand, where he had deep ties with corrupt officials. Others suspected he had fled to Myanmar, a country known for its lawless border regions and extensive black markets. As the months dragged on, sightings of him trickled in from all over Southeast Asia. A grainy CCTV image from Bangkok. A shadowy figure spotted in a casino in Sihanoukville. An informant claiming he had seen him boarding a private vessel off the coast of Vietnam. But every lead turned into a dead end, every potential arrest a false alarm. Meanwhile, the survivors of Somkai's human trafficking network were struggling to piece their lives back together. Many of them had been smuggled from impoverished villages, sold into slavery, and stripped of their identities. With nowhere to go and no families to return to, they found themselves trapped in a different kind of prison, a world that had moved on without them. Dara Mies, the journalist who had first exposed the trafficking ring, continued her relentless pursuit of the truth. She traveled to remote villages, speaking with families who had lost loved ones to Somkai's operation. She met with survivors who had managed to escape, each one bearing the invisible scars of their torment. Some had been forced into forced labor, working in illegal fishing fleets, sweatshops, or hidden factories. Others had been sold into the sex trade, their dignity shattered beyond repair. One survivor, a young woman named Chaneri, had been taken when she was just 17. She had been promised a job in a restaurant in Phnom Penh, but was instead sold to a brothel in an underground network controlled by Somkai's syndicate. For years, she had been passed from one client to another, drugged and beaten into submission whenever she resisted. By the time she was rescued, she was barely recognizable, her body a map of scars, her voice little more than a whisper. There were hundreds of stories like hers, each one more horrifying than the last. But even as the world condemned Somkai's crimes, the reality of human trafficking in Cambodia remained unchanged. New traffickers had already begun to fill the vacuum left by his disappearance. Small-time criminals, former members of his syndicate, and corrupt officials were all too eager to step into his shoes. The cycle of exploitation continued. Then, nearly 2 years after the raid on Somkai's estate, a breakthrough came. A man in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, had been arrested for attempting to use a fake passport. He was traveling under a false name, but his fingerprints told a different story. It was Somchai Virak. The fugitive had been hiding in Malaysia under the protection of a powerful crime syndicate. He had undergone plastic surgery, altering his features just enough to evade detection. But his arrogance had been his downfall. Despite his efforts to stay under the radar, he had begun to rebuild his empire. This time, trafficking victims from South Asia and Africa into illegal labor networks across Malaysia and Indonesia. When Malaysian authorities realized who they had in custody, they wasted no time. Within days, an extradition request was filed, and Somchai was flown back to Cambodia under heavy security. The moment he stepped off the plane in Phnom Penh, he was met with a media frenzy. Survivors of his trafficking ring gathered outside the courthouse, their faces a mixture of rage and relief. They had waited years for this moment, for the man who had stolen their lives to finally face justice. Inside the courtroom, Somchai sat expressionless as the charges were read aloud. Human trafficking, kidnapping, torture, murder. The list was endless. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, testimonies from survivors, financial records detailing his vast wealth, security footage from his compound, and intercepted communications between him and his associates. He never spoke a word in his defense. Perhaps he knew there was nothing he could say that would erase his crimes. The trial lasted for months, but the verdict was inevitable. Somchai Virak was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the survivors, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but the scars of their past would never fully heal. Many still struggled with the trauma they had endured, their nightmares filled with the echoes of their captivity. Some found solace in advocacy, working with human rights organizations to help others who had suffered the same fate. Others simply tried to fade into the background, hoping to rebuild their lives in quiet anonymity. Dara Mies, now an internationally recognized journalist, continued her work, shining a light on the dark underbelly of human trafficking in Cambodia. She knew that Somkai's downfall was just one battle in a much larger war. Because as long as poverty existed, as long as corruption thrived, as long as people were desperate enough to sell their own souls for a better life, there would always be another Somchai, another empire waiting to rise from the ashes. Somchai Virik's conviction was met with a wave of public outcry and celebration. The Cambodian government hailed the trial as a major victory in the fight against human trafficking, using it as proof that justice could be served even against the most untouchable criminals. International organizations praised the efforts of law enforcement, journalists, and human rights activists who had worked tirelessly to bring Somchai to justice. Yet, beneath the surface, the reality was far more complicated. The human trafficking network Somchai had built did not collapse overnight. While his capture and sentencing sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld, it did not stop the machine he had set in motion. Investigators soon discovered that many of his former associates had either gone into hiding or had taken control of different factions of the operation. The syndicate had been fractured, but not destroyed. Authorities attempted to dismantle the remaining infrastructure, launching raids on suspected trafficking hubs in Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Dozens of arrests were made, and hundreds of victims were freed from captivity. But for every raid that made headlines, there were whispers of corruption that allowed others to escape. In the wake of Somchai's downfall, a new name began to emerge in the shadows: Srey Shamron. Unlike Somchai, Shamron was a woman, and she operated with a level of cunning that made her difficult to trace. She had been one of Somchai's top lieutenants, overseeing the movement of victims across borders and managing the finances of his vast empire. While many of his former associates had been arrested or killed in the crackdown, Shamron had slipped away unnoticed, using forged documents to assume a new identity. For months, investigators chased rumors of her whereabouts. Some believed she had fled to China, where she had connections with organized crime syndicates that specialized in forced labor. Others claimed she had returned to Cambodia, blending into the upper echelons of Phnom Penh's elite. Reports surfaced of young women disappearing once again, of families searching for lost sons who had been lured with promises of jobs abroad. Shamron's methods were different from Somchai's. She operated in smaller cells, making it harder for authorities to track her down. Instead of relying on large-scale trafficking operations, she focused on elite clientele, politicians, businessmen, and criminal figures willing to pay exorbitant sums for trafficked victims. Her network was more discreet, more elusive. Dara Mies, the journalist who had played a key role in exposing Somchai's empire, now turned her attention to Shamron. Through her sources, she uncovered a pattern, a series of seemingly unrelated disappearances stretching from rural Cambodia to the bustling streets of Bangkok. Many of the victims were young women, recruited through false job offers in the service industry. Others were men, sent to work on illegal fishing boats or in construction sites with no means of escape. One particular case caught Dara's attention, a teenage girl named Neri, who had vanished from her home in Battambang. Her family had received a single message from her weeks after she disappeared, a brief voice recording that sounded rehearsed. She claimed to be fine, working at a restaurant in Bangkok, but her voice was laced with fear. After that, there was silence. Determined to find the truth, Dara traced Neri's last known movements. She traveled to the border towns where traffickers often smuggled victims into Thailand, speaking with local sources who operated in the gray areas of legality. She discovered that Neri had been taken to a compound outside Pattaya, a location suspected to be one of Shamron's new trafficking hubs. With mounting evidence, Dara contacted the authorities, but her pleas were met with bureaucratic delays and reluctance. Many officials feared retaliation from the criminal networks still embedded within the system. Some simply saw no benefit in pursuing a case that would bring them more trouble than reward. Frustrated but undeterred, Dara took matters into her own hands. She partnered with a group of activists who specialized in rescuing trafficking victims. They coordinated a covert operation, using hidden cameras and undercover informants to infiltrate the compound. What they found was worse than they had imagined. Inside the compound, dozens of victims were being held against their will. Some had been there for months, others for years. They were malnourished, beaten into submission, and too terrified to speak. Many had been forced into illegal labor, while others had been trafficked for far darker purposes. Among them was Neri. The rescue operation was swift but chaotic. As the activists led the victims to safety, gunfire erupted in the distance. Security forces loyal to Shamron had been alerted. In the chaos, Shamron herself slipped away, disappearing into the night just as her former employer had done before her. Neri was reunited with her family, but the scars of her ordeal would never fully heal. Like so many others, she had been robbed of her innocence, her dreams shattered by the cruelty of those who saw her as nothing more than a commodity. Dara's exposé on Shamroon's network sent shockwaves through the region. International pressure mounted on Cambodia and Thailand to take stronger action against trafficking, and for the first time, real change seemed possible. But Shamroon remained at large. She had learned from Somkai's mistakes, adapting to an ever-changing world where traffickers constantly evolved their tactics. Authorities pursued her relentlessly, but each time they closed in, she managed to escape. One step ahead of justice, one step deeper into the darkness. The fight against human trafficking in Cambodia was far from over. And as long as corruption thrived, as long as desperation existed, as long as men and women like Shamroon lurked in the shadows, there would always be another victim. Another story waiting to be told. Months turned into years, and the name Srey Shamroon faded from headlines. But for those who had been caught in her web, the nightmare never ended. The survivors, those who had escaped or had been rescued, carried the weight of their trauma, their stories etched into the fabric of Cambodia's ongoing struggle against human trafficking. Some found solace in rehabilitation programs, while others simply disappeared into the margins of society, unable to speak of what had happened to them. Dara Mies, the journalist who had dedicated her life to exposing these crimes, continued her pursuit of Shamroon, following every lead, every whisper of her whereabouts. She traveled through the border towns of Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand, uncovering remnants of Shamroon's operations. Safe houses where victims had been held were abandoned, their walls still bearing the marks of chains. Accounts from villagers told of convoys of unmarked trucks moving through the night, carrying human cargo to destinations unknown. The deeper Dara dug, the more she realized how expansive Shamroon's network had become. Unlike Somchai, who had relied on brutality and fear to maintain control, Shamroon operated in secrecy, forming alliances with corrupt officials, business tycoons, and underground criminal syndicates that made her nearly untouchable. Despite mounting evidence, arrests were rare. Every time authorities closed in, Shamroon seemed to be one step ahead. The few who did speak against her either disappeared or met untimely ends. Informants turned up dead in alleyways, their bodies left as warnings. Whispers spread that Shamroon had built an empire far beyond what anyone had imagined, one that stretched into the digital world, where victims were trafficked not just physically, but also through online exploitation. It was in 2025 that a breakthrough finally came. A young man named Vithu, a former victim who had escaped one of Shamroon's facilities, agreed to testify. Unlike many survivors who wished to remain in the shadows, Vithu wanted justice. He described the underground networks, the recruitment methods, and the locations where victims were held. His testimony painted a horrifying picture of modern slavery. Young men forced to work in scam centers, women sold into servitude, children trained for exploitation. With Vithu's help, authorities launched a massive international sting operation, targeting suspected trafficking hubs across Cambodia, Thailand, and the Philippines. Over 200 individuals were arrested, dozens of victims were freed, and vast amounts of digital evidence were seized. But Shamroon was nowhere to be found. Rumors suggested she had fled to China, where she had established ties with powerful syndicates. Others believed she had undergone surgery to alter her appearance, assuming a new identity to continue her trade. Some claimed she had simply vanished, retreating into the depths of a world where those with enough money and power could erase their past. Dara, now exhausted after years of chasing ghosts, found herself at a crossroads. She had dedicated her life to uncovering the horrors of human trafficking, but the deeper she went, the more she realized how vast and unstoppable the machinery of exploitation was. Every victory felt fleeting, every rescue overshadowed by the knowledge that there were thousands more still suffering. But she couldn't stop. Even as Shamroon remained a phantom, her name whispered in the dark corners of the criminal underworld, Dara knew that the fight was not just about one woman. It was about a system, an industry fueled by greed, desperation, and the willingness of those in power to look the other way. And so she continued. She wrote, she investigated, she exposed. Not because she believed she could change the world overnight, but because she knew that every story told, every truth revealed, was another crack in the walls built by people like Shamroon. And perhaps, one day, those walls would finally collapse. Case 5. Darwin, Australia, a quiet port city in the country's north, became the silent witness to one of the most horrifying human trafficking networks in the nation's history. With its vast waters, strategic location, and relatively loose maritime border control, The city had long been a target for those seeking to smuggle people into Australia. At the center of this illicit operation stood a man named Victor Langford. Born in Sydney in 1970, Victor grew up in a well-established middle-class family. His father was a businessman in the shipping industry, while his mother worked as a teacher. Despite having a privileged upbringing, Victor was never satisfied with an ordinary life. He was ambitious, cunning, and willing to cross any line to achieve wealth and power. His early career began in legitimate shipping logistics, but soon he realized that far greater profits lay in the shadows, away from taxes, regulations, and ethics. By the late 1990s, Victor had established connections with Southeast Asian criminal organizations, particularly in Indonesia, Cambodia, and Thailand. Initially, he smuggled contraband, untaxed cigarettes, liquor, and even rare exotic animals. But as the demand for illicit labor and migration routes grew, he saw an opportunity too lucrative to ignore. By the early 2000s, he had transitioned into human smuggling, working with a vast network of intermediaries who sourced desperate individuals from impoverished villages across Asia, promising them a better life in Australia. His operations were sophisticated. Using a fleet of cargo ships registered under shell companies in Panama and Singapore, Victor transported hundreds of migrants under brutal conditions. Many were hidden in sealed containers with minimal ventilation, often traveling for weeks without proper food or sanitation. Some perished before even reaching the Australian coastline. Those who survived were either sold into forced labor or left stranded in Darwin with no legal status, making them vulnerable to exploitation. The Australian authorities had long suspected human trafficking activities occurring along the northern coast, but Victor's operations remained elusive. He bribed customs officials, used encrypted communication channels, and constantly changed his shipping routes to evade detection. However, as the number of missing persons reports surged across Asia and the death toll of smuggled migrants increased, international law enforcement agencies intensified their efforts to dismantle the network. The first major breakthrough came in 2010 when an undercover agent infiltrated one of Victor's trusted smuggling rings in Indonesia. The intelligence gathered led to a large-scale investigation that connected multiple disappearances in Southeast Asia to arrivals of undocumented migrants in Darwin. Over the next 2 years, authorities monitored Victor's movements, tracking his financial transactions and mapping his criminal syndicate. By 2013, law enforcement was ready to strike. Australian Border Force, in collaboration with Interpol and the Indonesian police, launched Operation Nightfall, a coordinated raid on multiple locations across Australia and Southeast Asia. In Darwin, authorities stormed a private dock where one of Victor's ships was unloading its human cargo. Inside a series of modified shipping containers, they found over 200 malnourished migrants, many of whom had been locked inside for over 2 weeks. Some were barely conscious, while others had succumbed to dehydration and suffocation. Victor, however, had vanished. He had received a tip-off and fled before authorities could apprehend him. With forged passports and millions hidden in offshore accounts, he disappeared without a trace. For years, he remained a fugitive, moving between countries under assumed identities, always staying one step ahead of the law. But the past has a way of catching up. In 2018, Victor made a fatal mistake. He contacted an old associate in Bangkok for assistance in laundering money. Unbeknownst to him, the associate had already been working as an informant for law enforcement. Within weeks, Victor's location was pinpointed to a luxury villa in Phuket. A joint task force swiftly moved in, arresting him without resistance. Extradited to Australia, Victor Langford faced trial in 2019. The evidence against him was overwhelming, with testimonies from survivors, financial records, and intercepted communications sealing his fate. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for human trafficking, manslaughter, and organized crime. His conviction marked one of the largest crackdowns on human smuggling in Australian history, but the scars left behind by his crimes could never be erased. Many of his victims, who had risked everything for the promise of a better life, were left broken, some forever lost in a foreign land, others forced to return home with nothing but nightmares of their ordeal. Even behind bars, Victor remained unrepentant. To the world, he was a criminal, but in his own mind, he had simply been a businessman capitalizing on human desperation. The trial of Victor Langford was a spectacle unlike any other in Australian legal history. The sheer magnitude of his crimes, the lives he had shattered, and the intricate web of corruption he had built over the decades made it one of the most complex cases ever prosecuted in the country. As the courtroom filled with journalists, human rights activists, and victims' families, the weight of his actions became all the more evident. The prosecution presented mountains of evidence: financial records that traced his money laundering across offshore accounts, intercepted communications detailing the coordination of smuggling routes, and harrowing testimonies from survivors who had endured weeks of suffocation, starvation, and abuse inside his cargo containers. One of the most gut-wrenching moments of the trial came when a survivor, a young woman from Myanmar, took the stand. Through a translator, she described how she had been deceived by Victor's network, promised a well-paying job as a housekeeper in Australia, only to find herself locked inside a steel container with over 100 others. Many of her fellow passengers did not survive the journey. She recounted the horror of hearing people around her collapse from exhaustion, the desperate pounding on the container walls when the oxygen levels dropped, and the overwhelming stench of death as bodies piled up around them. By the time they were discovered in Darwin, nearly half of those in her group had perished. Her testimony left the courtroom in stunned silence. Even hardened law enforcement officers, who had spent years investigating Victor's operations, were shaken by her words. Victor, however, remained impassive. He sat in the defendant's chair with an eerie calmness, occasionally glancing at the prosecutors, but showing no visible emotion. To many, his lack of remorse was just as horrifying as his crimes. He was not just a smuggler, he was a man who had built an empire on human misery, profited from the suffering of thousands, and treated human lives as disposable cargo. The trial lasted for months, as the prosecution meticulously unraveled the extent of his network. It wasn't just Victor. His operation spanned across multiple continents, with corrupt officials, dock workers, and even law enforcement officers complicit in the scheme. Dozens of arrests were made as part of the case, with many of his closest associates facing their own trials. Then came the first attempt on his life. One night, during an evening lockdown, Victor was found collapsed in his cell, bleeding from a deep stab wound to his side. The weapon, a makeshift knife fashioned from a piece of metal, had been left near his body, its handle wrapped in cloth to avoid fingerprints. Guards rushed him to the infirmary, and he survived, but the attack sent a clear message. Even in prison, he had enemies. Some believed that the attack had been orchestrated by a rival smuggling syndicate, seeking revenge for business losses they had suffered after Victor's downfall. Others speculated that one of his former associates had turned against him, either out of fear or ambition. Whatever the reason, the attempt on his life marked a turning point. The once powerful smuggler began to withdraw even further, rarely speaking to anyone, and spending most of his time in solitary confinement for his own protection. As years passed, Victor Langford became a relic of a bygone era, a cautionary tale whispered among both criminals and law enforcement alike. His empire had collapsed, his allies had either been arrested or turned against him, and his hidden fortune remained just that, hidden. Some of his former associates attempted to rebuild what he had lost, but the world had changed. Law enforcement had adapted, growing more sophisticated in its tactics. The methods that had once allowed Victor to operate in the shadows were no longer as effective, and his successors found themselves facing increasing scrutiny. But even as Victor faded from the public eye, the scars he had left on countless lives remained. Survivors continued to struggle for justice, their voices often drowned out by shifting political priorities. The fight against human trafficking was far from over, and for many, Victor's conviction had been just the beginning of a much larger battle. And yet, despite everything, whispers persisted that Victor had one final card left to play, one last secret that had never been uncovered. Some believed that buried somewhere in his past was a key to the fortune he had hidden away, a secret stash of wealth waiting to be discovered. Others thought it was nothing more than a myth, a legend created to keep his name alive even after he had lost everything. But those who had known Victor Langford, those who had truly understood the depths of his cunning, knew one thing for certain: a man like him never left loose ends. As the years stretched on, Victor Langford's once feared name gradually faded from public memory. His empire of human smuggling, which had once funneled hundreds, if not thousands, of desperate souls into Australia's underworld, had been dismantled. The Australian Federal Police had ensured that his network was fractured beyond repair, and international authorities had worked tirelessly to eliminate any remnants of his global operations. Yet, despite his imprisonment, despite the justice that had been dealt, the ghosts of his crimes refused to be silenced. The echoes of Victor Langford's actions continued to ripple through the lives of those he had harmed, the bureaucracies he had manipulated, and the criminal underworld that had once thrived beneath his rule. For many of Victor's victims, the years following his downfall were not marked by closure, but by an agonizing uncertainty. Without legal status, many of those smuggled into Australia under his network found themselves trapped between two impossible choices: remain in hiding, living as shadows in a country that refused to acknowledge them, or risk deportation to the very lands from which they had fled. The courts had ruled in favor of offering asylum to some, particularly those who had been trafficked as minors, or who could prove they had been forced into labor against their will. But for others, the legal road was long, treacherous, and often fruitless. Some had no records of their existence in their home countries, making repatriation an impossibility. Others faced corruption and danger upon return, their debts to smugglers marking them as targets for violent retribution. For those who had managed to escape Victor's grasp before his empire collapsed, the trauma lingered like an unshakable shadow. People like Srey, the young Cambodian boy who had been forced into brutal labor, found themselves thrust into a world that did not understand their suffering. He was placed into a government housing program, shuffled between caseworkers and legal advisors, each promising help but delivering little more than paperwork and empty assurances. The psychological toll on survivors was immeasurable. Many had lived in captivity for years, their existence reduced to labor, fear, and submission. The concept of freedom, of autonomy, was foreign to them. They were free on paper, but imprisoned by their pasts. Some turned to underground economies, seeking work in illegal industries simply to survive. Others disappeared entirely, slipping into the anonymity of Australia's undocumented population, forever looking over their shoulders. Though Victor Langford had been convicted, law enforcement agencies refused to consider the case closed. Smuggling networks did not operate in isolation, and while Victor had undoubtedly been one of the most prolific traffickers in modern Australian history, he was not the only one. His arrest had created a power vacuum, and in the years that followed, whispers emerged of other smugglers trying to step into his place. Authorities feared that some of Victor's old associates, those who had evaded arrest, were regrouping. Investigators combed through financial records, offshore accounts, and encrypted communications, searching for any sign that his empire was being resurrected. They questioned informants, former enforcers, and even Victor himself, hoping to extract any remaining secrets. But Victor remained silent. Despite the years in prison, despite the failed assassination attempts, despite the knowledge that he would never see the outside world again, he never betrayed his network. He never gave up the names of those who had once worked under him, nor did he reveal the locations of his remaining assets. His defiance frustrated authorities, but it also fueled a darker suspicion. What if Victor was still pulling the strings from behind bars? One of the most persistent rumors surrounding Victor Langford's case was that he had hidden a vast fortune before his arrest. Investigators had seized millions from his operations, but the estimated total of his earnings far exceeded what had been confiscated. It was believed that Victor had stashed money in offshore accounts, buried cash in remote locations, or entrusted his wealth to hidden associates. Stories of Victor's hidden treasure became the stuff of legend within both law enforcement and the criminal underworld. Some claimed that encrypted ledgers detailing his finances had been lost in a fire during one of the police raids. Others believed that Victor had left behind a series of coded messages, clues leading to his secret fortune. Rumors circulated in Darwin and beyond, drawing treasure hunters, hackers, and crime syndicates eager to claim a piece of his lost wealth. Some scoured old hideouts, abandoned warehouses, and luxury properties he had once owned. Others turned to cyber investigations, attempting to track cryptocurrency transactions linked to his accounts. But despite the countless theories, no one ever found concrete evidence of the missing money. Victor, when questioned, would only smile, a knowing, cryptic smirk that infuriated both law enforcement and his former associates alike. Inside prison, Victor Langford was no longer the untouchable mastermind he had once been. The years took their toll, both physically and mentally. He had been a man who thrived in control, who built an empire from nothing and commanded fear with a mere glance. But prison stripped him of all authority. The failed assassination attempt had left him paranoid. He barely spoke to anyone, spending most of his days in solitary confinement, whether by choice or necessity. He was moved between different high-security facilities, each transfer meant to prevent any potential outside communication. His old allies had long abandoned him, and his family, what little was left of them, refused to visit. There was a moment when Victor tried to appeal his sentence, hiring a team of lawyers to argue for a reduced term based on good behavior. The appeal failed spectacularly. The court had no sympathy for a man who had profited from human suffering, and any attempt at redemption was swiftly denied. With no hope of release, Victor faded into obscurity. He became just another inmate in a system filled with criminals far less infamous than himself. The guards no longer saw him as a threat. The newer prisoners didn't even recognize his name. The empire he had built, the wealth he had accumulated, the power he had wielded, all of it meant nothing now. But the shadows of his actions remained. The survivors continued their silent battles, fighting for a future stolen from them. The investigators continued their relentless pursuit of justice, determined to dismantle every last remnant of his network. And the legend of Victor Langford, the smuggler, the mastermind, the ghost, lived on in whispered stories, cautionary tales, and unanswered questions. One night, years after his conviction, a guard making his rounds found Victor Langford sitting alone in his cell, staring at the wall. His hands were trembling slightly, his once imposing figure now frail, worn down by time and isolation. He had refused his meal, refused his medication, refused to speak a single word for days. When the guard asked if he was all right, Victor turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. And then, for the first time in years, he spoke. "They'll never find it," he whispered. The guard hesitated. "Find what?" But Victor only smiled. The next morning, he was dead. The official cause was listed as natural causes. His health had deteriorated, his body finally succumbing to the years of stress, confinement, and age. But to those who had pursued his case, to the men and women who had spent years chasing the shadows of his empire, his final words were a riddle that would never be solved. His fortune, if it existed, remained lost. His secrets died with him. But his legacy, the darkness he had cast upon countless lives, would never be forgotten. As the years passed, the legend of Victor Langford refused to die. Despite his death in prison, the ghosts of his crimes lingered like an unshakable curse. The survivors of his smuggling operation struggled to rebuild their lives. Law enforcement continued their pursuit of his hidden network, and the whispers of his lost fortune only grew louder. For the men, women, and children smuggled into Australia under Victor's network, life after his downfall was anything but easy. Though the kingpin was dead, the scars of his empire remained deeply etched into their existence. For people like Srey, the young Cambodian boy who had escaped forced labor, freedom was a complicated illusion. He was no longer confined to a hidden workhouse, nor was he shackled by the constant threat of punishment, but the psychological wounds ran deep. At 19, he was granted temporary residency through an asylum program, yet every step forward felt uncertain. He was free to walk the streets of Darwin, yet he remained an outsider, lacking education, family, and the ability to fully integrate into a world that had never been designed for him. Srey wasn't alone in this struggle. Many of the smuggled individuals found themselves trapped in legal limbo, their presence in Australia a question mark on the bureaucratic map. Some were granted refugee status, some were placed into temporary protection visas, and others fell through the cracks, left to fend for themselves in an unfamiliar country. A few had made their way into Australia's underground economy, some willingly, others out of necessity. Without citizenship or legal work permits, survival often meant resorting to illegal means. Undocumented labor, the sex trade, and other gray market industries. Some feared deportation more than anything, knowing that returning to their home countries could mean death, imprisonment, or being thrust back into the hands of another trafficker. The Australian government attempted to manage the crisis, but it was a battle with no easy solutions. Social workers, activists, and legal advocates fought for their rights, but the process was slow and riddled with red tape. For every victory, there were 10 more people who slipped through the system, their futures uncertain. Though Victor Langford was gone, law enforcement knew that his network had not simply vanished overnight. Smuggling rings did not operate in isolation, and Victor's empire had been built on the backs of dozens, if not hundreds, of associates, many of whom had never been caught. Detectives and intelligence agencies across Australia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific continued their pursuit of those who had escaped justice. Investigators pored over documents, tracking financial transactions, coded messages, and offshore accounts, hoping to find traces of Victor's remaining operatives. One name continued to surface: Raymond Gao. Gao had once been one of Victor's most trusted lieutenants, handling logistics and security for many of the smuggling routes. When the operation collapsed, he had disappeared, slipping into the shadows like a phantom. For years, there were rumors of his whereabouts. Some claimed he had fled to Thailand, using his connections to blend into the criminal underworld. Others believed he had moved further underground, working in collaboration with smaller trafficking rings that had begun to rise in Victor's absence. In 2028, a breakthrough came. A low-level informant arrested in Malaysia confessed to working for a mysterious benefactor, a man known only as the Ghost. His operations mirrored Victor's in many ways. Boats still arrived under the cover of darkness, fake visas continued to circulate, and human cargo was still being smuggled across borders. Interpol, working alongside Australian Federal Police, launched an operation to track the Ghost's activities. After months of surveillance, they uncovered a disturbing truth. Raymond Gao had not only survived Victor's downfall, but he had rebranded the network under a new identity. He had learned from Victor's mistakes, operating in the shadows rather than building an empire that could be traced. His methods were more discreet, his contacts more spread out. When authorities finally pinpointed his location, a luxury safe house in Jakarta, they prepared for the takedown. But by the time they arrived, Gao was already gone. All that remained were encrypted documents, burner phones, and a single note written in perfect English. "You're always one step behind." While law enforcement chased Gao, treasure hunters and criminals alike remained fixated on another mystery: Victor Langford's missing fortune. Authorities had seized over $200 million in assets at the time of his arrest: luxury properties, offshore accounts, cryptocurrency holdings. But it was estimated that his total earnings had been closer to $1 billion. So where was the rest of it? Rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed Victor had hidden vast sums of money in offshore havens under false identities. Others thought he had buried gold and cash in remote locations across Australia, a tactic often used by drug cartels to evade seizure. A few even speculated that he had used his influence to funnel his fortune into secret trusts, leaving behind coded instructions for his unknown heirs. In 2030, a journalist named Elliot Harper published an exposé titled The Last Secrets of Victor Langford. Harper had spent years digging into Victor's past, interviewing former associates, informants, and even retired detectives who had worked on his case. One of the most shocking revelations in the book was an anonymous testimony from someone who had allegedly worked in Victor's inner circle. The source claimed that before his arrest, Victor had hidden over $300 million in cryptocurrency, a digital fortune spread across multiple cold storage wallets, protected by an unbreakable encryption system. If true, it meant that Victor's wealth could still be out there, waiting for someone to unlock it. The book ignited a frenzy. Hackers, criminals, and even legitimate cybersecurity firms attempted to track down Victor's alleged crypto holdings. Some scoured the dark web for clues, while others searched through old police reports, hoping to find overlooked details. But just like Victor himself, his money remained elusive. And so, the legend of his hidden fortune only grew. Despite the passing years, despite Victor's death and the collapse of his empire, the scars of his crimes never fully healed. His victims carried their trauma like an unshakable weight. The law enforcement officers who had worked to bring him down continued to chase the shadows left behind. And the criminals who had once worked under him still roamed free, waiting for their chance to rise again. For the world, Victor Langford had been just another name, a kingpin who had met his inevitable fate. But for those who had lived through his reign, he was something far more sinister. A specter, a reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of society. A man whose sins could never be washed away, no matter how much time had passed. And though his body had long since turned to dust, his legend would never truly die. Even with Victor Langford's empire dismantled, the effects of his crimes continued to ripple through the world like aftershocks from a devastating earthquake. In Darwin, where his operation had flourished in the shadows for years, the scars he left behind refused to fade. The city itself had moved on, new developments, changing industries, and shifting political landscapes. But for those who had lived through the worst of it, the ghost of Victor Langford still loomed over their lives. Investigators continued to chase the remnants of his empire, hunting down stragglers who had slipped through the cracks. But for every loose end tied up, another one seemed to unravel, revealing just how deeply Victor had embedded himself into the criminal world. The survivors of his human trafficking ring remained caught in a system that struggled to accommodate them. Many had been granted asylum, but their futures were uncertain. Some fought to rebuild their lives, while others disappeared into the underbelly of the very country that had once promised them freedom. But perhaps the most haunting part of Victor Langford's legacy was the unanswered question that continued to drive criminals, investigators, and fortune-seekers alike. Where was the rest of his fortune? Despite law enforcement's best efforts, over $300 million remained unaccounted for, a staggering sum that could change the life of anyone who found it. Rumors of hidden caches, offshore accounts, and buried gold only fueled the obsession. One particularly persistent theory suggested that Victor had anticipated his downfall long before his arrest. He had been meticulous in his planning, always staying ahead of the authorities. Some believed that he had transferred his remaining wealth to an unknown heir, someone who had been waiting in the shadows all along, ready to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Another theory, one that had gained traction among the more conspiracy-minded, was that Victor had never truly died in prison. They claimed that the body cremated under his name wasn't his, that he had staged his own death and disappeared, leaving behind only false trails and red herrings. Though the theory was dismissed by authorities, it didn't stop amateur sleuths and treasure hunters from digging into his past, searching for any sign that he might still be out there. In 2032, nearly a decade after Victor's empire collapsed, an anonymous hacker released a set of encrypted files that allegedly belonged to Victor Langford himself. The documents contained fragments of bank transactions, offshore accounts, and digital keys, pieces of a puzzle that suggested the missing fortune was still out there, waiting to be found. The leak reignited the frenzy. Some claimed that the documents were a hoax, an elaborate scheme to lure unsuspecting criminals into a trap. Others believed that they were the key to unlocking the last remnants of Victor's empire. Authorities launched an investigation, but the hacker responsible vanished before they could be identified. The files were seized and analyzed, but no clear answers emerged. And so, the legend of Victor Langford's missing millions remained just that, a legend. While criminals chased Victor's fortune and investigators pursued his lingering network, the survivors of his smuggling operation struggled to find their own peace. Srey, the young Cambodian boy who had escaped the forced labor camps, had spent years trying to build a life in Australia. He had learned English, taken on odd jobs, and fought for permanent residency. But even as he tried to move forward, he couldn't escape the past. He still had nightmares of the cramped shipping containers, the suffocating heat, the relentless abuse. He still carried the weight of the countless others who had suffered alongside him, many of whom had never made it out alive. But he refused to let Victor Langford define him. With the help of a refugee advocacy group, he began sharing his story. He spoke at conferences, worked with journalists, and pushed for policies that would prevent others from falling into the same trap. He wasn't alone. Many of the survivors, once voiceless and invisible, had found their strength in speaking out. They became activists, counselors, and mentors for others who had endured the same horrors. Though they had once been nothing more than victims in Victor Langford's empire, they had reclaimed their own narratives. They refused to be forgotten. By 2035, Victor Langford's name had faded from the headlines. His empire was gone, his network scattered, and his fortune, if it still existed, remained hidden. But his legacy remained, woven into the fabric of Darwin's history like an unshakable stain. His crimes had exposed the dark underbelly of human trafficking, forcing governments to take action. His victims had become symbols of resilience, proof that even in the face of unimaginable horror, survival was possible. And yet, the shadows of his empire still lingered. Somewhere in the world, Raymond Gao remained at large, a ghost slipping through the cracks of international law. Smuggling rings continued to evolve, adapting to new technologies and loopholes. And the hunt for Victor Langford's missing millions remained an obsession for those willing to risk everything for a chance at fortune. Though his body had long since turned to dust, his story was far from over. Because in the world of crime, no empire ever truly dies. It simply waits for the next ruler to rise. Case 6. The cold wind of the English Channel howled through the narrow streets of Calais, a city that had long been both a gateway and a dead end for those seeking a new life. For centuries, the northern coast of France had been a critical point of passage, but in the late 19th century, it became infamous for one of the most extensive human smuggling operations in European history. This was a time of upheaval. Industrialization had left many behind, and thousands sought escape from famine, war, and persecution. The mastermind behind the operation was Charles Levesque, a man whose name was once whispered in the back alleys of Paris and beyond. He was no ordinary criminal. Born in 1852 to a modest family in Marseille, Charles was intelligent, calculating, and ambitious. He had grown up hearing stories of fortune seekers crossing the Atlantic, heading to the New World in search of a better future. By his early 20s, he had established himself as a merchant, dealing in textiles and precious goods. But legitimate trade was too slow, too limited for someone like him. He saw greater opportunity in the desperation of others. By the 1880s, Charles had built an underground network stretching from the ports of Bordeaux and Calais to the hidden docks along the Seine. He worked with ship captains, corrupt officials, and local enforcers, creating a well-oiled smuggling syndicate. The plan was simple but effective. He offered passage to America for those who had no other options, charging exorbitant fees that families would sell everything to afford. But the journey he promised was not the one he delivered. Victims were gathered in overcrowded warehouses on the outskirts of Calais. These buildings, disguised as legitimate lodging houses, were nothing more than prisons. Conditions were appalling: bare floors, little food, and the ever-present threat of violence. Hundreds were crammed together, waiting for the moment when they would be taken to the docks. Many never made it past these holding points, succumbing to disease and exhaustion. Charles's most trusted associate was a man named Henri Bisset, a former naval officer who had been dishonorably discharged. He handled the transportation, using fishing vessels retrofitted to conceal human cargo. The boats were small and barely seaworthy, yet they were crammed beyond capacity. Men, women, and children were forced into the hulls, given only enough air to survive. They were promised a journey across the Atlantic, but in reality, most were taken no further than the rocky shores of Britain, where they were abandoned, penniless, and unwanted. The British authorities had begun to take notice. Reports surfaced of half-starved refugees washing up on the coasts of Dover and Folkestone, many unable to speak the language, carrying only the clothes on their backs. Some had been deceived into thinking they had landed in America, only to find themselves trapped in a foreign land, hunted by law enforcement. The French government, under increasing diplomatic pressure, was forced to act. Surveillance of Calais intensified. Authorities raided warehouses, arresting low-level operatives, but Charles and Henri always remained one step ahead. With each new risk, they adapted their methods. They changed routes, bribed officials, and moved their operations deeper into the countryside. But the net was closing. By the winter of 1891, French investigators had gathered enough evidence to take decisive action. A single mistake, a shipwreck off the coast of Normandy, led to the unraveling of the entire operation. The fishing vessel L'Espoir had set sail from Calais, packed with nearly 100 passengers hidden below deck. It was meant to be a routine transfer, but the weather turned suddenly. A storm battered the fragile ship, tearing apart its sails and flooding its compartments. The weight of the human cargo made it impossible to stay afloat. As the boat began to capsize, the smugglers abandoned their passengers, taking the only lifeboat and leaving the victims to their fate. Fishermen discovered the wreckage the next morning. The bodies of dozens of immigrants had washed up on the shore, a harrowing testament to the horrors of the operation. The outcry was immediate. News of the tragedy spread quickly, reaching the highest levels of government. The French authorities, now under immense public pressure, launched an unprecedented crackdown. The first to be caught was Henri. He had attempted to flee to Belgium, but was intercepted at a train station in Lille. His arrest led to the discovery of coded documents that revealed the full scale of the smuggling network. Within weeks, dozens of arrests followed, but Charles remained elusive. He had always known this day would come. Using forged documents, he fled south, disappearing into the sprawling countryside of Provence. For months, he evaded capture, moving from village to village, bribing officials, and relying on old contacts. But the weight of his crimes caught up with him. In early 1892, an informant led authorities to a secluded farmhouse where he had been hiding. When the police arrived, he did not resist. The game was over. Charles was tried in Paris, in what became one of the most sensational trials of the era. The evidence was overwhelming. Survivors of his operation testified, recounting the horrors they had endured. Families spoke of loved ones who had vanished, their fates unknown. The trial captivated the public, exposing the dark underbelly of human smuggling. The verdict was inevitable. Charles was sentenced to life imprisonment, sent to the infamous prison on Devil's Island, where he would live out the rest of his days in obscurity. Henri, along with other key figures in the operation, faced similarly harsh sentences. The case of Charles Levesque and his smuggling empire became a defining moment in France's fight against human trafficking. It led to stricter laws, increased cooperation between European nations, and a greater awareness of the exploitation faced by those seeking a better life. But for the countless victims, justice came too late. Their dreams of freedom had been stolen, their lives forever marked by betrayal. And so, the story faded into history, a dark chapter in the annals of France's past. Yet the lessons remained, a reminder of how greed, desperation, and deception could intertwine, creating nightmares where there should have been hope. The trial of Charles Levesque was unlike anything the French courts had ever seen. The courtroom in Paris was packed each day with journalists, government officials, and members of the public eager to witness the downfall of one of the most notorious smugglers in European history. The case had drawn international attention, with newspapers in Britain, America, and beyond covering every detail. The sheer scale of Levesque's operation had shocked the world. For nearly 2 decades, he had orchestrated the movement of thousands of desperate souls, promising them passage to a better life only to abandon them to suffering, death, or worse. As the trial progressed, more of his victims came forward to testify. There was an elderly woman from Poland who had sold everything she owned to secure passage for her 2 sons to America, only to learn that they had drowned in the wreck of L'Espoir. A young man from Italy recounted how he had been crammed into the dark hold of a fishing vessel for days without food or water before being thrown ashore in England, left to fend for himself in a land where he knew no one. The testimonies were harrowing, painting a picture of a man who had not only deceived but destroyed lives. Charles himself remained eerily calm throughout the proceedings. Dressed in a finely tailored suit, he still carried the air of a businessman rather than a criminal. He rarely spoke, only addressing the court when questioned directly. When asked if he felt remorse for his actions, he simply shrugged. "I provided a service," he said coldly. "They wanted passage. I gave them what was possible." His lack of empathy infuriated the public. Outside the courthouse, protests erupted. Families of the victims gathered daily, demanding the harshest punishment possible. They carried photographs of lost loved ones, holding candlelit vigils as the trial stretched on for weeks. Henri Bissett, Charles's former right-hand man, had turned witness in exchange for a reduced sentence. He provided detailed accounts of how the operation had functioned, naming corrupt officials, revealing hidden routes, and exposing safe houses where immigrants had been held before their doomed journeys. His testimony was damning. Though Henri had played a crucial role in the smuggling ring, he painted himself as merely following orders, a soldier in Levesque's army of deception. When the final verdict was read, the courtroom fell into complete silence. Charles Levesque was found guilty on all charges: fraud, conspiracy, manslaughter, and unlawful trafficking of persons. The judge did not hesitate in delivering the sentence: life imprisonment at the notorious penal colony of Devil's Island, a fate many considered worse than death. The news sent shockwaves across Europe. Devil's Island, located off the coast of French Guiana, was infamous for its brutal conditions. Prisoners were sent there to disappear, swallowed by the jungle and the relentless heat. Escape was nearly impossible, with the treacherous waters surrounding the island ensuring that those who attempted to flee were never seen again. Charles showed no emotion as the sentence was handed down. He merely nodded, accepting his fate with an air of detached resignation. But those who had studied him knew better. A man like Charles Levesque did not go quietly. In the days leading up to his transfer, rumors swirled that he was planning something. Some believed he had secreted away a fortune, hidden somewhere in France or perhaps in one of the foreign lands where his network had operated. Others speculated that he had allies still working in the shadows, waiting to orchestrate his escape. The journey to Devil's Island was treacherous. A heavily guarded ship transported him across the Atlantic, with armed soldiers ensuring he never set foot on land until they reached the remote penal colony. Upon arrival, he was stripped of his fine clothing and thrown into a cramped cell, his past life vanishing into memory. For most prisoners, Devil's Island was a slow death sentence. Disease, malnutrition, and the relentless sun wore them down until they became ghosts of their former selves. But Charles Levesque was not like most men. He studied his surroundings, observed the guards, noted the weaknesses in security. He waited. Years passed, and though his name faded from the headlines, his legend grew in whispers. Some claimed he had bribed a guard, secured passage on a hidden boat, and vanished into the jungle of South America. Others insisted he had died alone, his body claimed by the sea. The truth remained uncertain, lost in the folds of history. But one thing was clear: the legacy of Charles Levesque had left an indelible mark. His empire of deception had forever changed the way nations approached human trafficking. Laws were strengthened, borders more closely monitored, and yet the cycle continued. Desperation still drove people to risk everything for a chance at a better life. And in the shadows, there were always others willing to exploit that need. For every Charles Levesque that fell, another would rise. Years passed since Charles Levesque was sentenced to life on Devil's Island, but the echoes of his crimes never truly faded. His name had become legend, a whisper among criminals, a cautionary tale among law enforcement, and a haunting memory for the families he had wronged. His disappearance into the depths of the penal colony only fueled speculation. Had he truly perished in the jungles of French Guiana, or had he orchestrated his own escape, slipping back into the underworld he once ruled? The truth, as it turned out, was far more complicated. The penal colony was designed to break men. It thrived on disease, exhaustion, and despair. The sun was merciless, the food scarce, and the guards cruel. But Charles was different. He had built his empire on patience and manipulation, and he understood the minds of men. He knew that power could still be wielded, even from the depths of a prison cell. At first, the guards treated him like any other prisoner, subjecting him to the same brutality they inflicted on the rest. But Charles had never relied on brute strength to control his fate. He relied on influence. He observed, listened, and learned. He watched which guards had weaknesses, who took bribes, who indulged in vices they weren't supposed to. And slowly, he started to regain control. He traded favors, information, contraband. He manipulated the violent hierarchy of the prison, turning rival gangs against each other while securing his own safety. His presence among the other prisoners was like a slow-working poison, eroding the structure of the colony from within. But survival was not enough. Charles had no intention of dying on that island. Escape was nearly impossible, nearly. The surrounding waters were infested with sharks, and the currents could pull even the strongest swimmers to their deaths. No one had successfully escaped Devil's Island before. Yet Charles was patient. He waited for the perfect opportunity. Years passed before the moment arrived. A new batch of prisoners had been brought in, including a young man named Etienne Rousseau, a skilled sailor who had been sentenced for smuggling stolen goods. Etienne knew the waters surrounding the island better than most, and Charles saw his chance. Through careful manipulation, he convinced Etienne that escape was possible. They would need supplies, a boat, and perfect timing. It took months of planning, months of bribing the right guards, gathering small stolen tools, and mapping out the weaknesses in security. But the day finally came. It was a stormy night, the kind of night where the waves crashed violently against the shore, and the guards took shelter instead of patrolling. Under the cover of darkness, Charles and Etienne made their move. They slipped through the cracks of the prison's decaying infrastructure, avoiding detection with expert precision. They had a stolen raft, barely seaworthy, but enough to take them away from the island and into the vast unknown. The currents were their greatest enemy. The raft was tossed like a child's toy in the chaos of the storm. Etienne paddled furiously, using every ounce of his strength to keep them on course. Charles, weakened by years of imprisonment, but still possessing the unyielding will to survive, clung to the raft, whispering instructions and promises of the fortune that awaited them if they made it out alive. For hours, they fought against the sea. The wind howled, the rain stung like needles against their skin, and the endless darkness stretched before them. Etienne was the first to falter. Exhausted, he collapsed, his body too weak to continue. Charles, though drained beyond comprehension, took over, willing himself to push forward. And then silence. The storm had passed, and the sun began to rise. When Charles opened his eyes, they were no longer surrounded by endless ocean. Land, the dense jungle of the South American mainland, lay before them. They had done the impossible. Etienne did not survive the journey. His body lay limp beside Charles, the toll of the escape proving too much for him. Charles, however, was still breathing. Barely. With the last remnants of his strength, he dragged himself onto the shore. He was free. But freedom did not mean safety. He was a fugitive now, a man without a country. He could not return to France, nor could he risk staying in one place for too long. He had only one goal: to rebuild, to reclaim his empire. And so, Charles Levesque disappeared into the world once more, a ghost reborn from the ashes of his past. For years, rumors would surface, whispers of a shadowy figure pulling the strings of human smuggling rings across the world. Some claimed he had changed his name, living under an assumed identity in South America. Others swore he had returned to Europe, hidden within the highest echelons of organized crime. But no one truly knew the fate of Charles Levesque. His name, once feared and reviled, faded into history. Yet, in the underworld, his legacy remained, a reminder that men like him never truly disappeared. They only adapted, and somewhere in the shadows he was still watching, still waiting. Years passed, and the name Charles Levesque became nothing more than a ghost story whispered in the criminal underworld. Law enforcement believed he had died somewhere in South America, lost to the elements or betrayed by one of his own. But the truth was far more sinister. After his daring escape from Devil's Island, Charles had done what he did best. He adapted. Alone and starving, he had wandered the jungles of the South American mainland, surviving on sheer willpower. He avoided local settlements at first, knowing that any unfamiliar face would draw suspicion. But he needed resources. He needed a way back into the world he once controlled. Eventually, he found refuge among a group of smugglers operating along the coast of Venezuela. They dealt in everything: guns, drugs, stolen artifacts, but most importantly, people. It was a growing industry, and one Charles knew better than anyone. Though he arrived as a desperate fugitive, it didn't take long before he had their leader's ear. His experience, his knowledge of European trafficking networks, and his ability to manipulate people made him invaluable. At first, he operated in the shadows, advising the smugglers on how to expand their routes, how to bribe the right officials, and how to avoid detection. But Charles was never content being second to anyone. Slowly, he began dismantling the organization from within, turning its members against each other, creating dissent, and ensuring that when the time was right, there would be no one left to oppose him. Within a year, the smuggling ring's original leader was found dead, his body floating in a Venezuelan river, his throat slit with the precision of someone sending a message. No one questioned who was behind it. By then, Charles had already assumed control. But Venezuela was just the beginning. With his network growing, Charles set his sights on something bigger. The European human trafficking market was evolving, becoming more sophisticated, more lucrative, and more dangerous. Smugglers were no longer just petty criminals. Many were working in collaboration with corrupt politicians, high-ranking officials, and even multinational corporations that turned a blind eye to the suffering they profited from. If Charles was going to reclaim his place at the top, he needed to be smarter than before. And so he vanished once again, this time not out of necessity, but as part of a plan. For 2 years, there were no traces of him. Some believed he had finally been killed. Others thought he had gone into hiding, living out the rest of his days in quiet anonymity. But the truth was, Charles had spent that time carefully building a new empire, one larger and more powerful than anything he had controlled before. By the time whispers of his return reached the ears of European intelligence agencies, it was already too late. The smuggling routes that once operated independently were now connected, forming a vast web that spanned continents. Refugees fleeing war-torn regions, young women promised jobs in foreign countries, and desperate families seeking a better life. All of them became products in Charles's new empire. He didn't just smuggle people. He sold them to factories that needed cheap labor, to criminal syndicates looking for new recruits, to underground markets where human lives were treated as disposable assets. And with every transaction, Charles grew richer. But wealth was never his true goal. Power was. Unlike before, he did not make the mistake of becoming a visible figure in the trade. Instead, he worked through intermediaries, men and women who acted as his lieutenants, each of them believing they were in control, never realizing they were just puppets. He orchestrated deals from the shadows, ensuring that no single person could tie him to the growing crisis unfolding across Europe. But power comes with enemies. As the scale of the operation expanded, so did the attention it attracted. Intelligence agencies across France, Germany, and the United Kingdom began piecing together the puzzle. Thousands of missing persons reports, overlapping smuggling routes, and the sudden appearance of organized trafficking cells in cities that had never seen such activity before. It all pointed to a single, unseen force at the center of it all. Interpol launched an investigation, and for the first time in years, Charles felt the pressure of being hunted again. But he had learned from his past mistakes. Every lead that authorities followed led them to dead ends. Lieutenants who had never met Charles in person, financial trails that vanished into offshore accounts, and witnesses who mysteriously disappeared before they could testify. The few who did speak of him described him as a myth, an unseen force who dictated orders but was never seen. To law enforcement, he became a phantom. But even phantoms could bleed. A single mistake was all it took. In 1997, a raid on a warehouse in Marseille led to the discovery of a shipment bound for Northern Europe. Dozens of people, most of them young, terrified, and malnourished, were crammed into shipping containers like cargo. But what made this raid different was not just the rescue of those inside. It was what the authorities found hidden among the documents left behind. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, a direct connection was made to Charles Levesque. A single signature on a financial transaction. A careless error. It was enough. France's highest law enforcement agencies launched the largest manhunt in recent history. Every border was monitored, every known associate interrogated. Anonymous tips flooded in, some false, some containing fragments of truth. But Charles was not the same man he had been before. He knew that his time was running out. His empire began to crumble from within. Some of his most trusted lieutenants, sensing that his reign was coming to an end, betrayed him in exchange for immunity. Corrupt officials who had once protected him now distanced themselves, fearing they would be exposed. He had spent his entire life ensuring that he would never be caught. But even the most powerful criminals eventually fall. In December of 1998, in a remote countryside estate near Lyon, Charles Levesque was finally found. He did not go quietly. When authorities arrived, they were met with a fortified compound, armed guards, reinforced gates, and enough firepower to hold off a small army. The standoff lasted for hours. Negotiators attempted to convince him to surrender, but Charles knew there was no escape this time. With no way out, he made his final move. A single gunshot rang through the night. By the time authorities breached the compound, they found him lying on the floor of his office, a pistol still in his hand, his body surrounded by stacks of documents detailing the full extent of his empire. In death, Charles Levesque had ensured that no one would ever see him in chains. But his legacy remained. The documents left behind exposed a network so vast, so deeply entrenched in global corruption, that it took years to fully unravel. Arrests were made across continents, politicians were disgraced, and laws were changed to prevent such an operation from ever happening again. But for those who had suffered under his reign, there was no true justice. For the thousands of lives lost, for the families torn apart, and for the ones who were never found, justice came too late. And somewhere, in the darkest corners of the world, new criminals rose to take his place. Because power, once lost, never disappears. It simply finds new hands to hold it. The fall of Charles Levesque should have been the end. His empire had crumbled, his name forever tied to one of the darkest human trafficking networks in modern history. But as investigators sifted through the ruins of his operation, it became clear that his death was not the conclusion of the story. It was only the beginning of a much deeper nightmare. The documents found in his estate revealed more than just smuggling routes and financial transactions. They contained a blueprint for an operation that extended far beyond what authorities had imagined. Charles had not merely built an empire, he had designed a system that could function without him. In the months following his death, raids were carried out across Europe and South America. Dozens of high-ranking operatives were arrested, their testimonies exposing a network of government officials, businessmen, and law enforcement officers who had profited from the trade. Corruption ran deeper than anyone had anticipated, and as the trials began, the world watched in horror as the scale of the conspiracy unfolded. But there was something more disturbing than the corruption itself. Even with Charles gone, the network continued to function. Shipments were still being intercepted at ports. Victims continued to disappear. Smugglers who had once answered to Charles were now operating under new leadership, one that remained hidden in the shadows, just as Charles had. The investigation, which had begun as an effort to dismantle a single criminal empire, now turned into a war against an invisible enemy. For law enforcement, it became a race against time. For the victims still trapped in the system, it was a fight for survival. And for those who had known Charles Levesque personally, there was a chilling realization. He had always planned for this. From the very beginning, Charles had understood one undeniable truth. True power does not lie in a name. It lies in an idea, and ideas do not die. They evolve. By the time authorities finally unraveled the full extent of his legacy, it was already too late. The system he had created had outgrown him. The leaders who replaced him had learned from his mistakes, making it nearly impossible to track them. The story of Charles Levesque became a cautionary tale, one that served as a grim reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of society. His empire was gone, but the trade he had perfected, it continued, and in the end, that was his greatest triumph. The fight against Charles Levesque's empire had reached a crucial turning point, but the realization that his system continued without him left authorities grasping at shadows. Investigators had dismantled key operations, seized assets worth millions, and arrested dozens of high-ranking associates. Yet the network adapted like a living organism, regenerating in places where it had been wounded. The finality of Levesque's death had created an illusion, one that fooled even the most seasoned law enforcement agencies. They had believed his execution would break the chain, but in reality, it had only made the organization more resilient. Without its figurehead, it became leaderless yet decentralized, harder to track, and impossible to fully erase. In the years following his downfall, a chilling pattern emerged. Routes that had once been exclusively controlled by Levesque's operatives were now being utilized by new factions. Survivors of the smuggling operations reported hearing the same stories from their captors. Whispers of a man who had foreseen everything, who had prepared for every eventuality. Levesque never truly died, some traffic victims later recounted to journalists. His system lives in the hands of those who were always meant to take his place. Evidence gathered in subsequent raids supported this claim. It wasn't just former associates continuing the trade. Entire new cells had emerged, adopting Levesque's tactics, utilizing the same supply chains, bribing the same officials who had once been loyal to him. The organization had evolved into something even more insidious. Interpol and Europol attempted a joint crackdown, deploying specialized units to France, Spain, and Italy. But every time they thought they had cornered a major player, they found themselves facing nothing more than another expendable operative. The true architects of the renewed trade remained faceless, their identities buried beneath layers of offshore accounts, encrypted messages, and false identities. For every door that was kicked open, two more remained locked. One of the darkest revelations came when a survivor, a young woman named Elodie, escaped from a compound in the French countryside and provided authorities with a horrifying testimony. She had been trafficked for 3 years, moved between safe houses and underground facilities, each run with military-like precision. The men she encountered never spoke of a leader, never referenced Levesque's name explicitly, but their instructions were chillingly uniform. They told her she would never be free, that there was no escaping this system, that even if she did, there would always be others. Elodie's rescue sparked renewed efforts from human rights organizations, and with their assistance, more victims came forward. They described routes stretching across Africa, Asia, and even reaching the Americas. The sheer scale of the operation defied belief. It wasn't just an empire, it was an entire industry. By the time authorities traced the highest-ranking members of the new syndicate, they discovered a reality more terrifying than they had imagined. The leaders who had replaced Levesque were no longer mere criminals. They were business executives, politicians, and investors who had found ways to legitimize their wealth through real estate, shipping, and even humanitarian aid programs. They had taken the foundation Levesque had built and merged it with modern financial infrastructure. Some of the very institutions that had once fought against human trafficking were now unknowingly funding it. As public pressure mounted, a task force was formed, an unprecedented coalition between intelligence agencies, financial regulators, and undercover investigators. Their goal was simple: to uncover the masterminds who had turned Levesque's criminal empire into a global enterprise. But as months turned to years, the task force encountered a disturbing truth. For every person they arrested, another rose to take their place. For every organization they dismantled, another adapted and evolved. Human trafficking, they realized, was no longer an empire that could be conquered. It had become a shadow economy, one that had existed long before Charles Levesque and would continue long after. The fall of Levesque had been a victory, but the war was far from over, and as long as there were people willing to exploit the vulnerable, the cycle would never end. Despite the relentless pursuit of justice, the war against human trafficking remained a fight against an enemy with no face and no single name. Levesque had been a villain, a symbol of one of the most horrifying criminal empires in modern history, but in truth, he had never been the real monster. The real monster was the system itself, the demand, the corruption, the desperation that fueled an industry worth billions. Years after his death, investigative journalists attempted to trace the remnants of his empire, piecing together stories from victims, whistleblowers, and former operatives. What they found was both expected and deeply unsettling. The routes remained open, the methods refined, the operations disguised beneath layers of corporate legality. The faces had changed, but the business had not. New leaders had emerged, nameless and faceless figures who understood that survival lay in discretion. Unlike Levesque, they did not seek power in the underworld. They sought power in the boardroom, in government offices, in industries where money could be laundered and exploitation could be masked as opportunity. They learned from his mistakes. They were untouchable. Authorities continued their fight, dismantling networks wherever they could, rescuing as many victims as possible. But with every victory, there was the bitter knowledge that it was not an end, only a temporary disruption. The tragedy of Levesque's empire was not that it had been built. The tragedy was that it had never truly fallen. It had simply changed hands. The aftermath of Levesque's downfall should have been a moment of finality, a conclusion to one of the most intricate human trafficking syndicates France had ever seen. The headlines declared victory, officials spoke of justice being served, and the world moved on, satisfied with the belief that a monster had been slain. But those who understood the depth of such operations knew better. Levesque had not built his empire alone. He had been a central figure, yes, but a machine as vast and complex as his syndicate could not be dismantled with the death of one man. His influence had reached far beyond the underworld, embedding itself into the very fabric of society. Banking institutions, shipping companies, falsified employment agencies, and even government contracts that had unknowingly facilitated his logistics. The roots of his network were tangled within legitimate businesses, leaving behind a structure that, while shaken, was far from destroyed. In the months following his death, law enforcement agencies across Europe continued their pursuit of the remnants of his empire. Raids uncovered hidden warehouses, financial trails led to offshore accounts, and testimonies from rescued victims painted an even grimmer picture of just how expansive his reach had been. But as one operation was shut down, another surfaced elsewhere, almost as if his organization had anticipated its leader's demise and prepared for succession. New names emerged in intelligence reports, figures who had once been loyal to Levesque, but were now forging their own paths. Some were former lieutenants who sought to rebuild what had been lost, while others were entirely new players who had watched from the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to claim a share of the empire. The business had not died. It had simply evolved. The resurgence was not immediate. For a brief period, it seemed as if Levesque's death had indeed sent the criminal world into disarray. Trafficking routes were disrupted, shipments delayed, and those who had once relied on his network were left scrambling for alternatives. But as months turned into years, the underworld adapted. New alliances formed, fresh routes were established, and the scars of his reign faded into a new, more sophisticated structure, one that learned from his mistakes and refined its operations. For law enforcement, it was a frustrating reality. Despite their best efforts, the industry of human exploitation proved to be an ever-evolving entity, fueled by demand and sustained by corruption. The cycle repeated itself, and though individual victories were achieved, rescues, arrests, convictions, the greater war remained far from won. In a quiet office in Paris, an aging investigator sat before a case file that never seemed to close. The faces had changed, the names replaced, but the stories were eerily similar. Victims taken from their homes with promises of a better life, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare. Smugglers who had perfected the art of deception, weaving lies so seamlessly that even seasoned officers struggled to unravel them. A chain of command that had no beginning and no end, ensuring that, no matter how many pieces were removed, the system continued to function. He sighed, flipping through the pages of reports that told the same story again and again. Levesque had died, but his empire had not. It had simply learned how to survive.